My pleasure. So I guess we should get this show on the road then. So we are, for those just joining us, this is a study group about philosopher Kenneth Smith, and we are in a long series working our way through his book Millennia and Microcosm, which started out as a column in the Comics Journal back in the late 90s and early 2000s, and we are in the process of converting it into a book. Pretty much one column instance per chapter. And part of what we're doing with this is we're exploring the text and the ideas together, and I'm furiously taking notes about footnotes and things to put into the book to help make it more accessible to people. We are in chapter 3. I shared a link in the chat to chapter 3. Chapter 3 has 2 parts. The first, epochs and regimes, we did previously. We're now working our way through introduction to the issues. And in introduction to the issues is structured around a series of fantastic quotes from great writers and thinkers of the past. We're past the Paul Valéry. We're past the Edward Gibbon. We're past the Black Elk. I know it says Black Hawk, but that's Black Elk and Demetrius of Phalaris. And last week we discussed the Gilbert Murray and Max Planck quotes. And this week we're going to tie that into the following 3 paragraphs that expand upon it. And what he's doing with this series is really, with a series of quotes in this intro, is he's trying to help the reader understand the project of this book. And the project of this book is to get us to be able to understand the worldview of 3 different epochs of history well enough, to put ourselves in their mind space well enough that we don't just caricature them the way that moderns always do, that we don't just turn them into whatever versions of themselves, cartoon versions of themselves, please us or satisfy us or make us feel like the most objective, advanced people in history. Instead, he's trying to get us to where we can learn to see them from their own perspectives, to understand them, their worldview, enough to be able to get out of the modern view and switch back and forth between these 3 different perspectives. Because the most important thing is to learn not to be trapped by your own perspective. And so this is a very handy exercise for us to take these other 2 well-documented worldviews and learn the exercise of putting them on, evaluating the world and ourselves with them, and then taking them back off again and moving back to one of the others. And by doing that, not only do we develop this proficiency that he thinks is fundamental to philosophy, but we begin to understand ourselves as moderns for the very first time. As moderns, our worldview is the water we swim in, and as so we don't see it, and we take for granted all kinds of things that are actually really weird, stereotypical positions of the modern world that nobody else in other epochs would agree with us that those things are obvious. They'd say, that's not obvious, that's just you identifying yourself as a modern. Nobody else sees the world that way. And until we go through this exercise and learn to see from the perspective of different epochs, we are unable to get out of our lenses and mirrors long enough to turn around and look at it and understand what it is. It's only then that you can start to begin to have some freedom of choice about who you want to develop into as a person. So long as you're just symptomatizing the stereotypes of your era, no matter how much you think, no matter how hard you work at thinking and trying to understand, you're using the tools that you were given. And so as a result, you're just building out the labyrinth around yourself rather than actually freeing yourself from it. This is one of the fundamental paradoxes of philosophy. Almost every week I quote the Nietzsche quote. He says, philosophy is only for the healthy. The sick it has ever made sicker. And part of what's hiding inside that Nietzsche quote is the idea that trying to use the mind to free yourself from the trap of the mind before you understand what the trap of your mind is merely entraps you further, even while you think you're being liberated. So that's the exercise of this book. It's to learn to really get out of a modern interpretation of the medieval world and to get out of a modern interpretation of the ancient world and start to see them from their own perspectives and from each other's perspectives, and then to turn them around to look at the modern world to see what we're stuck in and learn how to get out of it. Phil and then Stephen. Go ahead, Phil.
Yeah, this thing about these epochs, which is sort of cycles or parts of cycles, uh, reminds me of this, and I'll start out with the quote, from Max Planck. A new scientific truth does not triumph by convincing opponents and to make them see the light, but rather because the opponent eventually die and a new generation grow up that is familiar with it. And my first thought was, of course, the opponents don't have to die yet. They just have to be out of power. Okay, they have to move out of power. And this then remind me of that within the cycles, if the epochs are the large cycle or the long cycle, then there are cycles in between. And it reminds me of Neil Howe's The Fourth Turning. Those of you might want to take a look at it. And he thinks of the fourth turning. It goes in approximately about a 90-year-long cycle in which each of the generations that go before are actually motivated by different concepts and different aspects of these things. And so therefore it changes. And he actually equates it in a very rough metaphorical way. He doesn't explicitly underscore that, but in a metaphorical way that is equivalent to the 4 cycles of the season. The spring, which new generation and new ideas spring forth. The summer, in which, in a sense, those ideas are developed and instituted in a structure. The fall, when it begins to be overextended and things begin to question itself, and then finally the winter, the age of the season of, I'll say, the falling and the season of trouble before the new, and that actually pushes this medium cycle, I guess a generational cycle, into a thing that had to find yet a new idea. And he says we are in the 4th cycle and things are going to happen, And the 4th cycle, he says, probably began about 2000. That's why he called it the millennials. The millennials are going to spring forth new ideas. And so it's interesting. And of course, the cycles also remind me, I'll actually give you some, the video. The 4th cycle has arrived with Neil Howe. So that's the title of it. And he was an advisor. He's kind of a historian and a theorist, but he also advises people in finance in a very general way. And so this was a interview with a person that was interested in the market, but there was also other tapes about him. So it's interesting to talk to him. But this also reminds me of the hermeneutic circle of Heidegger, right? That you're thrown in this swirling circle of things that in some sense is vague, but you find you have to somehow in the swirl develop the hermeneutics of understanding these things that keep occurring, and then suddenly you realize there's connection between them, and so therefore be able to interpret information and appearances is an important part of this cycle of understanding, because it's really very chaotic, particularly in the 4th cycle, that you have to be able to, as you would put it, give it different frames of reference. This hermeneutic circle is the circle of interpretation, which is so important to make connections of things that are just swirling around, and you begin to understand it. And so that's interesting about the cycles keep coming back in some way.
So what was the name of the of the thinker who introduced this seasonal model?
Neil Howe, his name is spelled Neilhowe. And you could find many things about him, but he wrote a very famous book called The Fourth Cycle, and he's working on a follow-up right now.
Oh, the fourth turning.
The first turning, that's right.
Okay. Okay. Thank you. Yeah, I'm going to put a link to the Wikipedia article just so we don't lose track of it. Thank you for that. It's part of what's interesting about kind of part of Smith's core argument here is a lot of people who call themselves philosophers, what they want is to teach you their system as an ideology and have you conform to it. And they want to give you the answers and have you memorize the answers and be able to regurgitate them correctly. And, Kenneth Smith often frustrates readers because he precisely refuses to do that. He says his purpose, no human being's purpose is to pretend to be God and hand you down a set of answers, because the human condition is a mortal condition. And as mortals, we begin from a position of thinking we understand, but not understanding, because we're not authors of reality. We're participants in it. Our ego, our noesis wants to lead us to believe that we are principally authors and creators. And in so doing, it wants to ignore the other faculty of the mind, gnosis, which recognizes that as much as we can influence the world, we also suffer. Our experience of life is a pathos, not suffering as in pain, but suffering as in being subject to, not being God, not being the king, not being the creator, but instead finding ourselves in the middle of things we don't understand. And getting to the point where you can start to ask philosophical questions in the first place usually requires passing through a really egotistical intellectual stage along the way, in which you get overconfident that you understand how things work. This might be called adolescence. For some people, it never is. But part of what happens when you hit the philosophical stage of mental development is you begin to understand that everything you think is wrong. It may not be completely wrong, but none of it is completely right. And that the things that we're missing when we try to describe the world aren't just petty details we can safely suppress into the background, but they're often the important context that gives meaning to the thing that we think. And by not having the right context, our information turns out to be noise. It's a difficult and shocking position to be in. And it kind of corresponds in some ways to the seasonal model that you're describing Neil Howe as presenting, Phil, because, I think it's Hegel who has the quote, the owl of Minerva only takes flight with the fall of night. It's when people are comfortable and satisfied and society seems to be working and families seem to be working, people tend to not be very philosophical, because you don't really have to question your assumptions and your worldview. They seem to correspond to reality. It's during the winter phase of a civilization, when things are falling apart and not making sense anymore, that people get frustrated and they start looking for new answers. And in the process of looking for new answers, a very small subset of them will even start to question themselves and their assumptions and their understanding. And from such things, you get philosophical movements. I'm going to call on Stephen and Peter in a second, but I just wrap that up with kind of two other things that are closely related. Is that the cyclical model you're describing is very close to the Navajo model of life and a year and the universe and everything. They're very focused on the wheel of the seasons, right down to the fact that the traditional octagonal house, the hogan that they live in, is laid out according to four sides that correspond to the four directions of the compass, which correspond to four stages of life, they too see the cyclicity of nature. And it's part of what drives Hegel's philosophy, this notion that the cycles of nature that we are all caught up in have to be part of our understanding of the world, because if they aren't, probably our model is too artificial. That an organismic model rather than a mechanical model is what's called for. So thank you for bringing that up, Phil. Stephen and then Peter. Go ahead, Stephen.
Yeah, I'm rather intrigued by that. We have Caesar's statement there, a famous quote that yes, men freely believe what they desire. It seems to be people are in the grip of
Yes.
their preferred outlook, because I take a behaviourist point of view that the people believe their preferred outlook is the one that's going to deliver them the goodies. This is my critique of, say, Marxism. Marxism replaced Christianity with the heavenly Jerusalem with the workers' paradise. Hitler offered his 1,000-year Reich. Don't worry, guys, I know it looks bad at the moment, but paradise is just around the corner and the sacrifices will be worth it. Has always been the legend that people are giving you. But it's an intriguing thought. I've been looking at early Christianity, the heresies and its development, but the claim there would be the predominant Christian group was simply the one that produced the most children.
Yes.
The Gnostics just weren't going to win.
Yeah,
They
right.
didn't believe in reproduction.
Right, they thought it was evil.
Of course, the cyclic elements of culture you could perhaps take back to Oedipus. Oedipus is a person who guesses the answer with the Sphinx. Sphinx goes on to rule, and then it becomes blind to what he doesn't like to see.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, Oedipus, people don't often connect the riddle of the Sphinx that's presented by Sophocles in Oedipus with his own story, right? The idea that all of us, no matter how clever or smart or, in control we think we are, subject to the cycles of life. And his very rise to fame and being able to defeat the Sphinx begins with a recognition of the cycles of life. And yet the tragedy of his own life is that at his peak, he doesn't know where he came from. And he doesn't know, and because he doesn't know where he came from, he doesn't understand his own relationship to the major players in his life, to the man at the ford who he killed, to the woman who he married. He's a information out of context. And as a result, it creates catastrophe.
Oh, of course, you got the irony there that, who was it? Tiresias, was it? The blind prophet points out, how can you with two good eyes be blind to the truth?
Yes.
And
yes.
this is the irony that what a man with two good eyes who refuses to see is no better than the blind man.
Yes. Yes. And this is where one of the classic quotes that has a profound philosophical significance but arises out of the tragic tradition comes. Cleon, the unheeded thing escapes. Right? This is an explication of what the oracle at Delphi says when it says Gnothi se auton. It says, you think you have a grasp on things, but you don't. There are many, many things you don't take heed of, and the things you don't take heed of are not in your control. They don't stay within the limits that you wish that they would stay within. There's a whole wisdom tradition that goes back to the lyric poets associated with this. And of course, I'm gonna draw off of, Phil is often a champion of what Oedipus does after Oedipus Tyrannus. And
Absolutely.
I want to emphasize that as part of this cycle and say, the full story of Oedipus can't be known from just his worst time and his fall. It also has to include the time afterwards when all that bitter experience has given him some wisdom, and it's transformed him from a character who wants to be heroic but is tragic into a character who sees himself as carrying this burden, and his awareness of his burden virtually makes him sacred. All the people around him begin walking on eggshells around him because they recognize the gravitas of the painfully won wisdom that he carries with him.
Well, could I just interrupt since you brought that up? I was going to bring that up. That's why I raised
I
my
thought
hand.
you would.
And what happened in the final scene of Oedipus Rex was he plucked out his eyes, right?
Right.
And he plucked out his eye, which means that he is now blind and he's not confused by the hither and thither of the world. He's now has developed an internal eye to see himself for who he really is. And that's why he became a wise man, right? At Colonus, I thought that was a wonderful play because it wasn't really, it's classified as kind of a tragedy, but it wasn't a tragedy at all. So that was, I think that's why it's sort of like not promoted as much as the other two plays.
Yeah, well, and it has a lot of counter-modern wisdom. there's things in Oedipus Colonna that make us very uncomfortable. we don't really want to deal with the full implications. This is another kind of signature of Kenneth Smith's approach, is that he is an eclectic. Rather than being a systematizer who's very carefully suppressing everything that's false and highlighting everything that's true, he's working in art and literature and so many other sources. And as part of that, he's underscoring how different the classical Greek perspective on art was from ours. We see art, modernism sees art as something that you might make some money from, or get some fame from, or get some entertainment from. It has use value, and the use value is the only value that it can possibly have. But to the ancient Greeks, that whole tradition of competing with producing tragedies to be performed at the Olympics and at other seasonal games was based around the idea of trying to translate the difficult wisdom of their polytheistic religion into something that was accessible, that would dramatize the core lessons in a way that even remarkably dense people would have a chance of walking away with some kind of understanding of the profundities of life. And the Sophocles cycle around Oedipus was part of that. That this was, we talk about, and moderns recognize the sports side of these seasonal games that the Greeks established, but we don't recognize the art and literature side, which was also from the beginning instituted as part of it and was seen as core to it. It was part of their religion to constantly come back to these touch points and try to recenter themselves around new interpretations of old wisdom. Peter, then Sharon, then Donald. Go ahead, Peter.
I do want to, if I may, briefly touch upon the Gregory Bateson movie you recommended and how it relates to the current topic of Kenneth Smith.
Thank you,
I do think that when it comes down to context versus the idea of finding pattern or principle, and how each one can sort of confuse the other, I suppose, in regards to one relies too much on the witnessing of pattern or principle and ignores the context. One looks too much at context to the point of where one cannot then find pattern because the individuality of the exact situation, all patterns end up breaking down because you see the level of individuality and uniqueness of any given situation, just as the idea that you never step into the same river twice, and yet on another level, it is the same river. So how does one relate to the relationship, let's say, in regards to interpretation and perspective of what we experience between relationships? And I think that Gregory Bateson came up with this idea of the relativity of it, of the arbitrariness in relationship of perspective. And yet, when he's describing it, which is my own personal view of his discrepancy, was this relationship to scientific thought as being convenient. Now, to me, convenience is a perfectly valid reason, and it's not arbitrary at all as a motivation to look at it one way as opposed to another in regards to what you're attempting to accomplish. This idea of acknowledging the subject in regards to your own biases, wants, and goals in relationship to the utility or aesthetic of any given interaction.
Yes.
And I think that therein lies something that, at least from his presentation in the movie, he didn't seem to see. And I think that that's in part one of that fundamental issues of that inability to relate within the relative in regards to creating besides simply just analyzing the kind of interaction you are trying to achieve and what angle of approach is more better than otherwise. For it is in any given context that we find the most useful form of measurement. Now, when it comes down to, in my opinion, of the value of, I don't know, I mean, Oedipus in regards to the classical view and as well as my view, I mean, granted, you know, it's all range of interpretations, but honestly, for me, I viewed it cowardly. He couldn't deal with the horror of this breaking this most fundamental taboo of Greek culture. And even though he was an honorable man in relationship towards abiding by that fundamental of sacrilege, to look at the inability or the failing of his literal eyes to bearing witness to who his actual father and mother were, to me, that's an extremist action. And regards to his lack of courage to have an inner eye and both eyes open. He was a brilliant king. The people loved him, but he decided to be a beggar instead because he couldn't deal with his own self-hatred and simply, in my opinion, ran away from himself. And I kind of think it's important to look at that sort of contextual example of him being a tragedy, because I sort of feel that there is that lack of potential forgiveness, or let alone this disillusionment of his own purity, that I think that he wasn't able to survive. And I think therein lies that fundamental issue of that lack of progress and adaptability to the kinds of discrepancies of one perspective another. Oh no, everything must be fundamentally objective. No, something may fundamentally subjective. That I need to have things exactly clear in relationship to what is, either there's a best relationship or it's all fine. And I kind of see that both of those angles limit our awareness of our biases, not to necessarily get rid of them, but to acknowledge them as being fundamentally part of the equation in the first place. I sort of feel that that element is the most missing in our consideration of all of these sort of these forced intellectualizations that force things into a 1 or 0 in regards to our own discovery about what seems to work best in the context.
Right. Yeah, the law of the excluded middle is a killer for us. That tendency that everything needs to be true or false, right or wrong. It gets us involved in a sorting operation that often involves hiding from ourselves part of the picture, and reducing complex things into simple caricatures.
Yes, and the other false dichotomy that I think is as equally important as right and wrong is absolute or relative. Yes. That's the one I think that people need to really address in regards to the philosophical speculation.
Right. Yeah, it's part of what's hard to grasp about Kenneth's core position about worldviews, because as moderns, we're raised with the idea that there's true and false. There is the absolute objective truth as it is, which, science will give to us, even though science tells us that its methodology doesn't involve dealing in absolutes. Nevertheless, functionally, it's presented to us as all other approaches are wrong or superstitious or primitive or ridiculous. And that whatever imperfections result from the scientific process, we just have to deal with them because it's better than all the alternatives. But so that prepares us to that plus our 12 years of math to get started in our education prepares us to think of things as being discrete, that they have borders and boundaries, and they are one thing and they are not other things. The lines between things become strong. Part of what's hard about Kenneth's position is that he's saying a sophisticated organic perspective on reality requires not just that we simply negate the law of the excluded middle, not just that we say, well, there is no truth, but rather that we adopt an even more profoundly counter-modern position, which is that, okay, there is a cosmos. It was here before we even evolved. It'll be here after we're gone. There is a reality to be known. The problem for us is that the cosmos is infinite in many different ways at the same time, whereas we're finite when it comes to the capacity of our mind. We are mortal and our time to try to figure things out is limited. And there are piles upon piles of additional limitations beyond that, such as the fact that by the time we start looking at the world and thinking about it as thinkers, as people who are trying to understand, we've already been acculturated to take for granted a specific position by default without examining it closely. And the result of that is that we only get one glancing, brief, aspectival perspective on an infinite thing.
To push up against that, sorry.
And so what we need, he says, we're never going to actually have the truth per se, but what we need is to free ourselves from the idea that there is one perfect, right, mortal position that will give us all the answers. And we need to be able to get to the idea that we need to collect positions and understand them from their own terms, and from each one see what it has to teach us that the other perspectives can't teach us. And from this, we have this life project for as long as we're alive of trying to work out tangentially an understanding of the world that's better than the one that we started with when we first started asking questions.
I do fully appreciate that in regards to, it's very much in line with my own principles when it comes down to collecting diversity so that the colors that I have to paint and view from are diverse can be, so then there's greater sense of what seems to be the most appropriate perspective to the given situation. What type of colors actually work best for the painting that I'm trying to cultivate. And for that, I think that's always I think a wise position. To me, it's the potential limit there, because one could I think going with this metaphor, there's so many people that keep themselves from painting because they still are collecting different colors. And I think therein lies that kind of passivity, that fundamental passivity in relationship to interaction with life, that they're not actually dancing. They're not actually exploring. They are simply going along with all these abstractions and confusing the map to be the territory.
Yes. Hegel's classic critique of Kant compared him to a medieval peasant or a medieval intellectual who did not want to get into the water to try to swim until after he'd already become a master of swimming. He says, you got to understand, we learn by doing, and it means you're going to screw up publicly. And that's just the normal process of learning. You can't wait until you're perfect to get started, or you'll never get started. I'm with you 100%. And, I grew up in a martial arts tradition with traditional Okinawan karate and Kobudo dojos. And, you practice your katas and your techniques in full view of people who know better than you do. Your every move, your every gesture is like an essay on all the things that you don't understand. And yet you learn to be comfortable with it because, in the classic tarot, the very first card, number 0, is the Fool. Because you have to be willing to embrace the absurdity and foolishness of doing anything in order to get anything done. You have to say,
and yet,
go ahead.
And yet the Fool, it all comes back to it in relationship to that naivete, the limits of knowledge as a fresh ground, fresh soil to cultivate all of what may potentially grow.
Yes.
And yet that kind of that seasonal theory, that seasonal model in regards to knowledge about the potential benefits of any given idea to compared to the place of which it is held.
Yes. And I'm going to call on the line of people waiting in a moment, but there's one other thing I particularly wanted to touch on that you said, and that's the use value, the pragmatism of a thing. And in this case, Kenneth's response would be that use value per se isn't the right category. That use value is a Banausic, Noetic, modernist view of the world, and that there is a more profound thing that corresponds to use value, but at a higher level that goes beyond noesis, that incorporates gnosis as well, where you can say, I may not be able to rationally justify this thing, but I'm going to do it anyway. I may not be able to prove the usefulness of this flower, but I'm going to plant it anyway because it feels right, because I feel like it should be there, because I've seen it before. It doesn't, not everything needs the kind of accounting that use value sort of incorporates within itself. And this is why he says that what Hegel calls Vernunft, the third and highest form of thought, which combines gnosis and noesis together, it involves an enormous amount of subjective taste and experience to kind of feel your way forward, because only a certain percentage of things can be systematically accounted for and added up mathematically to be proven, you know, like use value. There's a lot of things that you do because, I mean, in the highest forms of thought, there are a lot of things that we do even though we can't justify them, and that's even right. So I understand. I know you didn't mean use in that perspective. I'm mostly explicating because we got a larger group of people here, and not everyone's going to know exactly what you meant. But use value is one of those particularly charged terms that Hegel talks about a lot as being one of the characteristics of noesis, that they're obsessed with use value. So Sharon, then Donald, then Phil, then Stephen. Go ahead, Sharon.
So I'd like to go back to the 30,000 foot level.
Yes.
And I have a question.
Please.
I think for the last couple of weeks, I do not know how many, we've been talking about end times and civilizations, and we've been going through these epochs and see how they differ one from the other.
Yes.
Well, I like that because I find it is so relevant to the time in which we live, and it's probably relevant to all the time. So this weekend I was reading an essay from Yuval Harari, who wrote *Sapiens*, and he asked the question that I am going to ask now. He says, at the heart of the Ukraine crisis lies a fundamental question about the nature of history and the nature of humanity. Is change possible? As we go through all these epochs, one of the things we're carrying along is us as human beings. And our basic desires and nature and behavior is an evolutionary process. I look at the war in Ukraine and it looks no different than Hitler, than the way Hitler behaved. The same tendencies. He is invading raid for his own personal power. So my question is, as we differentiate between these different epochs, and Kenneth Smith talks a lot about moderns and their failings, right? I think it's just basic human nature. Give me a perspective on that. And I see Peter talking about the way we make decisions, the way we engage. Those are things that are common in all civilizations.
Yeah, you know, the thing about the kinds of categories that Hegel or Smith or Kierkegaard or Arendt or others would be bringing to bear on these questions of different epochs, it cannot be noetic systematic categories with either strong either or divisions where we say if you're this, you absolutely aren't that. We're not saying they're utterly alien to each other, because it's all about the human animal. You know, we're trying different ways of organizing ourselves in the world in search of what is healthy and sustainable and rewarding. And we, much like a tragic character, we don't know in advance what's the right thing to do. And so we're following patterns. So what it means is that all of these different modes are different expressions of the same fundamental struggles and the same fundamental nature. It's just that they use different metrics, would be a modernist way to put it. They use different contexts for interpreting the world and themselves, for making these kinds of decisions. Why, you know, sure, an ancient would go to war for, and a medieval would go to war, and a modern would go to war. But what do they think they're doing when they go to war? Why are they going to war? What are they trying to accomplish? What kinds of warfare would they consider acceptable or not acceptable, and why? That whole matrix, and I don't mean it in the sense of the movie, but in a biological sense. The matrix within which these decisions are made shapes the way that our behavior comes out. So, for example, should there be Geneva Conventions? Should there be rules of warfare that say that some things are not acceptable and others are? Different people have answered that question differently at different times. One of the things that Thucydides writes about in the Peloponnesian War is the way that Sparta, but also Athens, when they defeated a city that had fought against them, they would kill every last adult man in the city, just kill them all. And all the women and children would be sold into slavery, and the city would be eliminated. It basically would, it didn't exist anymore. Or if it did, it existed, colonized by Athens or Sparta, repopulated with the people within it, no longer free. And from a modernist perspective, or at least a late modernist perspective, that's deeply abhorrent. That's a war crime. It's crimes against humanity. You must not do that. It's wrong, right? We have Geneva Conventions against that, but in ancient Greece, it was the norm. That's how they did things. And part of what the purpose of exploring these different epochs is about is trying to understand why do we do this differently than they did? Why, what is our explanation to ourselves? What is our justification? Nietzsche talks about this. He's got a whole essay he wrote about the ferocity of the classical Greeks. He says, you read some of their wisdom literature and you come out of it with this sense of their humaneness. And you say, this is amazing. These people, why can't we be more like them? And then you read a passage from the Peloponnesian War and you're like, oh my God, we don't want to be anything like those people. How could the people who wrote this essay on love and compassion turn around and do that to a city? How is that even possible? And the answer is, if you understand their worldview, their epoch, then you can understand why they would do what they do. And in the same way, you got to be able to say, how can the people who wrote the Geneva Conventions firebomb Dresden, firebomb Tokyo? How we do mass extermination of our own, but how we do it, when we do it, how we explain it to ourselves, the amount of propaganda we deploy to the public to tell everybody we're not doing it. These are all things that are specific to modernity. An ancient Greek would never have done a massive disinformation campaign telling everybody that they absolutely weren't razing a city to the ground, killing all the men and selling the women into slavery. It's inconceivable to them that they should hide the thing that allowed them to secure victory. But to us, it's essential and inevitable. And in that difference is part of what we're talking about in this book of essays.
So can I just bring one point up? I like that last point that you just raised, because I think what you're talking about is the fact that we have different tools, different ways of informing the populace, right? And in the essay, he makes an analogy, which I'm going to read, and I want you to comment on. He said, many elites in history, Hun chieftains, Viking jarls, and Roman patricians, for example, viewed war positively. Rulers from the Sargon the Great to Benito Mussolini sought to immortalize themselves by conquest. And in brackets, he has an artist such as Homer and Shakespeare happily obliged these fantasies. So the culture solidified these acts. Other elites, such as the Christian church, viewed war as evil, but inevitable. So what I thought is that as we go through epoch, there are episodes or times when they engage in violence.
Yes.
And that changes, and that the culture is either supportive, the culture is usually supportive of it, particularly if the powerful ones, the ones in power, decide that it's normal. So I start to look at the whole concept of war as we go from ancient to medieval to moderns.
Yes.
Right? Because I think human nature has a violent side to it.
So there's an interesting quality. Part of what's hard for us as moderns is we're inclined to take for granted that we're normal and that everybody must have been more or less like us. This is what we're taught, that they either were like us or they were primitive versions of us who would have wished that they could be like us. But we have this, our approach to norm is we have this normative reading of history in which what we do is normal. And so it can be really easy to overlook examples that suggest that the way we approach the world is not normal. I'll give you one example. I was just reading yesterday about the Treaty of Point Elliott here in the Pacific Northwest, where Governor Isaac Stevens signed a treaty with all the Pacific Northwest Indian tribes, setting up the system of reservations, allowing them to create Seattle and Bellevue and these other cities and so forth. It's interesting to me because one of the principal tribes involved, the Duwamish, their land was where Seattle is now, were promised a big reservation, and then the federal government never gave it to them. It's an ongoing thing. It will eventually make national news because I'm convinced that under this Interior Secretary, that's finally going to be reversed after more than a century. But you read the treaty, and it's just patently obvious that we're in complete violation of the treaty, and therefore we don't have the rights to even a square inch of Seattle. Literally, by treaty, none of this is ours. It couldn't be clearer. But you know, when you read about the Treaty of Point Elliott, part of what they talk about is how frustrating it was for people of European descent to try to negotiate with these tribes because we assumed they had chiefs. And they didn't. These Pacific Northwest Coast tribes didn't have a chief in the sense that we understand it. If they went to war, if there was a battle, some senior experienced men would be appointed as war chiefs. But if the elder women disapproved of their military aspirations, the women could just say, "You're not the chief," and abruptly they weren't, and the war was over. Now I want you to think about that and imagine the old women of France telling Napoleon Bonaparte he's not the emperor, and all of a sudden all the wars end. Can you see that happening in European history? Because I can't. They had an entirely different kind of culture than we have. Mm-hmm. And the norms of the culture and the rules of the culture were so different that when you see it in operation, it's just shocking. You say, well, that must be a fantasy. That can't possibly be true. But of course, we have documented instances in the Pacific Northwest of exactly that happening. Some war chief got too big for his britches, and the women said, "You're not chief anymore." And all of a sudden he wasn't, and the war was over and he was kicked out. And it wasn't done with police forces or military forces. It wasn't done with a coup d'etat or a junta. They just had a fundamentally different interpretation of the world and power than we have inherited because of European history. And that goes to the heart of what we think human nature is.
Yes.
Because we're trying to generalize from European or European influenced examples. And because we do that, it creates all these blind spots for actual human behavior in the world over thousands of years, but that we erase because it's incompatible with the models that we've been taught. And that's what this whole book is about. How do we get out of that trap?
Yeah, but there's just one last sentence before I finally be quiet, because I like the one that Kenneth Smith said here. In the middle of the third paragraph that we're discussing today, he said, but a civilization or a culture, even in decline, continues to control the way its subjects interpret its vitality and authority. Those are the women that would say you can't go to war anymore, right?
Yes.
I think that kind of validates what you were just saying.
Yes.
The way they interpret the vitality and the authority of the culture depends on whether they give permission to it or not.
Yeah. Yeah. You know, I can't remember if it's between past and future or if it's in the human condition. But Hannah Arendt has a spectacular essay called What is Authority that I strongly recommend everybody read. Part of what she talks about in that essay is the idea that we have been conditioned to imagine that authority comes with force, right? The authorities are the ones you can't disobey. They've got the military, they've got the law and the courts, they've got jails, they've got police forces. Those are the authorities. But Hannah Arendt says that is a very modern interpretation of the word authority. And there is an older and frankly more potent interpretation of authority, which is if you want to learn how to be a good gardener, should you ask the people around you who know nothing about gardening? Or do you want to ask the old man down the road who spends all of his time in his backyard and has the most amazing garden that he did himself? There is a natural authority that we are biologically predisposed to recognize in people, in which authority isn't something that they take by force or that we agree through oaths to follow or submit to. All of that is sort of extraneous to the notion of authority. That's coercion. Actual authority is something that people have and that other people recognize, and that leads those people to follow the people who have authority. If I want to learn great kabuto, I go find a great kabuto teacher who knows more about it than I do. You know, if I want to learn gardening, I find great gardeners who know more about it than I do, because they have authority. But what's fascinating about the modern world is our notion of authority is the other one, the coercive, artificial, conventional one. And as a result, it is frequently the case that the people who have the obviously, objectively, anybody could see they have the most authority have no power at all. They're often sidelined and shoved out of, you won't find the great master gardeners in charge of the Department of the Interior. You won't find, it's the same everywhere, right? A lot of the people who rise to 5-star general they're not the best fighters, they're not the best strategies, but they're the best political animals and they know how to work the system. And so there is this disconnect between what even a word like authority means that's caught up in that quote that you're citing. Our culture teaches us that authority is one thing, and we all learn to act as though it is, even though universally throughout the world, every culture in every era has had this innate ability to recognize genuine authority. And so we have side by side a reality that we're sort of ignoring and an artifice that we're obeying because our civilization taught us to. And that's sort of what Kenneth would say is that diremption happens on everything that matters within a civilization. They give you schemas of interpretation that we are taught to take for granted as the way things are, even though in fact they're not at all the way things are. They're just the way that we're pretending they are. Donald, then Phil, then Stephen, then Buddy. Go ahead, Donald.
Well, Phil got me to thinking, we're coming back to Oedipus with this
Yes,
constantly reinterpreting. And this is something that civilizations do. I mean, we reinterpret here in the US our foundational myth, if we would talk about it. What happened at the Constitutional Convention, whatever.
yes.
But there's something about not just this activity, but the content, because I noticed the last 2 weeks that the United States is greatly focused on understanding the Batman again. The topics you take up also reflect on your epoch.
Yes.
There is a content, the subjects you deem important. And apparently, it's cartoon characters for us. I don't mean to step on David or anything, but, it's not Oedipus.
Right.
We're not there.
Right.
So enough.
Yeah, and that's a huge part of it, is that modernity makes these promises about the possibility of human understanding and objectivity. Now we're going right to the text, right? We we are raised to believe that, all men are created equal and we're endowed by our creator with certain inalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But underlying that entire document is a belief in human reason as being capable of getting us to the truth. And if we all just sit down and talk things over together, the modernist premise is we don't need laws of nature or theocracies to tell us what to do. We can just rationally work it out because, we're all rational, aren't we? That's what modernity says. We are. So we can just talk it out and figure it out and we'll get to the answer. And thus to use a theme that Stephen often uses and used earlier in this, thus utopia will follow, right? We just need to talk enough and reason enough and it will lead us to goodness and truth, surely, all the days of our lives. But the problem is that there's enormous numbers of counterexamples to that. And he cites Murray and Planck right off the bat here. Murray talking about the entire history of Christianity. That's 2,000 years of history. Murray summing up there. Well, at his time, it was 1,900 years of history, but I don't think anything's happened in the last century that would cause us to fundamentally disagree with his observation. It's extremely upsetting, but it flies in the face of the modernist promise. 2,000 years of history that don't align with the way that we interpret human reason. And in case that is seen as, well, that's okay because it's religion, it's not about the truth, what's true and false, he then slams us with Max Planck. And this Max Planck quote comes from, of course, I say this every week because I don't want us to lose track of the references here. It comes from Thomas Kuhn. That's where Kenneth Smith and a lot of people first encounter. Fewer people read Max Planck's scientific autobiography than read The Structure of Scientific Revolutions by Thomas Kuhn. And Kuhn builds on Planck's observation, but he's basically saying, even in what is supposed to be the sacred space of modernity, where we are the most rational, the most objective, the most rigorous, the most concerned with truth, even in that place, the truth does not persuade us. What persuades us is orthodoxy. And the only times that, and this to build upon the quote, the only times we are persuaded by scientific truths that fundamentally disagree with us is when we didn't really care about that issue anyway. We're willing to give it up because it doesn't strike to the bone for us. And then we collect those examples and say, look how objective we are. I can give you a list of 1,000 things that I changed my mind on. How rational I must be, how reasonable I must be, how enlightened and modern I must be. But in building that list that we use to self-identify in that way, we are carefully not building a list of all of the things that did strike to the bone for us, that were core issues to our worldview, that we never changed our minds on and never will, because we aren't actually as rational as we think we are. We're willing to play the rationality game when things don't matter to us. But when push comes to shove and we get down to brass tacks on those things, when presented with counter evidence, we double down. And we see this over and over in American politics, right? It happens all the time.
It's interesting, I think, that all the modern political movements claim to be scientific.
Yes.
Which, I mean, clearly Marx and Lenin, stuff do.
They claim to be scientific.
But so do our Western political schemes that they evolved from some scientific understanding of human nature or of psychology, and we have political science to back this up.
Yes.
So it is unusual that our politics is scientific.
Right.
I mean, I should have put quotes around that or something. Yeah. It's
well,
it's ideological.
That's right. I mean, you could see this in this goes to what Sharon was asking about, what the point she was making. The war if we're fighting war in the ancient epoch and we're fighting war in the medieval epoch and we're fighting war in the modern epoch, doesn't that say that for whatever divides us between these epochs, we have this enormous amount in common and that war is part of our nature? And, you know, within the framework of colonizer history, we certainly see war as an endless motif. But beyond that, what's fascinating is how if you wanted to get people into a war in the medieval epoch, you couldn't convince people by appealing to science. That would not work. You could not say, behold the experiments I have conducted, and I was published in the journal Nature and the American Psychological JAMA. You couldn't say, look at my pedigree and look at this list of bibliographical references, ergo we must go to war. And yet when we wanted to get into the Gulf War, you had generals presenting to Congress evidence of, you know, yellow cake uranium that was located at this position and location. They had to lay out, you know, their arguments and their evidence so that there would be a scientific motivation for getting into the Iraq War, which of course was not why we got into the Iraq War, as was later much, you know, revealed, even though a lot of people don't want to talk about it. We had entirely different reasons for doing it. But unlike the ancient Greeks, we didn't feel like we should say, well, the reason that I'm going to go kick the ass of that city-state is because I feel like it. We couldn't say, I want to do it because they're strangling my trade and I'm tired of it. We have to do it because we say, oh, they're a threat to world peace. You know, look at the covenants that they've broken and the evidence that we've collected and so forth. In the medieval world, you had to say it was because God wanted you to. If God did not approve of the war, it didn't matter how much it would benefit you personally. It didn't matter how rich it would make you. It didn't matter how angry they'd made you. None of that was relevant unless it was a divinely sanctioned war. That's the definition of the medieval epoch. God's on top. And so even when they had the most cynical of motivations, they couldn't go to war unless they could deploy God in such a way that the population was convinced that this was holy. If you could convince them it was holy, you could do it. But if you couldn't convince them it was holy, you couldn't do it. And this is where we get at the weirdness of worldviews that we take for granted.
Yes.
Which things happened that couldn't have happened in any other epoch? And which things didn't happen that could have happened in any other epoch, but not this one?
Of course, the Greeks,
the
citizens had to vote for war and elect their generals.
Right?
You know, and it was those that voted that got to go fight it.
Right?
You know,
how much different would US military history be if all those Congress critters and presidents and CEOs were all on the front lines? How many wars do we get into specifically because the people who are calling for the war know 100% certainty they will not be at risk? You choose different wars and you fight them very differently if you think you will or will not be on the receiving end of whatever is being dished out. It changes the nature of the history. It changes which things happen and which things don't. You know, part of the reason you had to have a code of chivalry in the medieval epoch is that it was the nobility who were riding out to war. And the last thing in the world they wanted was it to be normal to slaughter or torture the people on the front lines because it was them. They're like, you know, your arguments for a code of chivalry are very different when your rulers are fighting than they are when you're doing mass industrialized armies sending out the poorest of people who've been raised in such impoverished conditions that going into the military is actually a really appealing economic deal for them. This is a different kind of war with different kinds of codes. Phil, then Stephen, then Buddy. Oh, Sharon, go ahead.
Can I I like this sentence by Kenneth Smith because I read ahead.
Yeah.
He said, for a people not to grasp, and that's exactly what you're talking about, what ultimately contributes to human orderliness, and what fractures or innovates that order is not to discriminate between virtues and vices, values and vanities, soulish roots and its subjective cancers, moral assets, and biopsychological liabilities. And that's how I think as a people, we get hoodwinked into these wars. I mean, the story that Putin has sounds very similar to the one that George Bush had. It's got no underlying facts, right? And yet we saw this weekend in Russia, you had a stadium full of people. I don't know what the numerical count is, but there are people endorsing the ideology that he put forward.
Right.
And so I like how Kenneth Smith summed it up there.
Yeah, it's very good. He's putting his finger on it. And
Yes.
what's hard for us is that as moderns, there were periods of modernity where moderns all felt a lot of sympathy for each other and were very excited. They thought modernity was this amazing concern and we were going to go places together. Now we're in late stage modernity and we're skeptical about each other.
Yes.
So we're doing scapegoating. So we're willing to admit that there are enormous numbers of moderns who do not live up to the promise of modernity, but we always want it to be the other guy because the law of the excluded middle, we want all of the goodness to be on one side and us to be there, and all the badness to be on the other side and the bad guys over there. So this is like how US politics becomes 100% polarized into a sense that everything wrong with modernity must be laid at the feet of the other political party so that we can continue to bask in the glory of the promise of modernity with which we've propped up our entire psychology and national culture. And meanwhile, we have an explanation for all the things that are going wrong. It's those guys over there. If we just stick it to those guys, then we will be able finally to fulfill the promise that is conspicuously not being fulfilled. And when you look at this kind of low level, I'm going to use modernist terms that I'm ashamed of, but that we all understand, this primitive, subjective, completely not advanced psychology at work in saying we're the good guys and they're the bad guys, right? It is a complete betrayal of everything that modernity claims for itself. Even what the good guys are doing is a betrayal because they're scapegoating. They're engaging in what we call superstitious fantasies. If we can just drive out the goat carrying the sins, then all will be well. And we'll be able to get this train back on the tracks, right? Underneath this vast structure of appeals to science and objectivity still runs this kind of childish emotional train. And I'm using the word emotion as something to scapegoat here, not because I believe emotion is bad, but because modernity teaches us that emotion is bad and intellect is good, that ignorance is bad and education is good, that modern and recent and advanced are good and old and primitive and savage are bad. This whole value system that we have, when you actually turn it on itself to look at itself, it ends up condemning itself. And that's why starting about the mid-stage, any epoch, especially modernism, starts to systematically, industrially lie to itself about itself to avoid having to face the ways in which it's not fulfilling its promises. The longer it can go on not facing the truth, the longer it can drag out, its lifespan, despite the fact that it's already peaked, obviously already peaked. In so many measurable ways, it's in trouble. But the longer it can avoid talking about it, the more it can just sort of keep going. It's a little alarming, to be a culture. One of the keys to understanding Kenneth Smith's philosophy is that he doesn't believe he's above all of this. He knows perfectly well he's a modern. He was raised in the same propaganda and ideology the rest of us were. He feels, just like any of us feels, the appeal to superiority and advancement and intellect and the great march of progress. It's like the heart of a modern yearns for the vision of Star Trek and how we will boldly go into the stars and explore strange new worlds, and it will just get better and better forever because of scientific progress and enlightenment. We feel that call because we are moderns. Medievals felt that call about something completely different. And if we tried to draw them with the picture of Star Trek, they would not feel a thing that we feel about it.
You're saying Gene Roddenberry was Oedipus?
That's a longer discussion. So it's part of the key of understanding each of these epochs is what did their heart yearn for? How could you get all of the medieval nations of Europe that were squabbling over territory and fighting with each other to all of a sudden unite and go charging off to Jerusalem? What was the call? And the call was not return on investment. It wasn't look at these quarterly profits. It was not look at these studies and my bibliographic citations. Like none of the things that motivate a modern were involved in getting the medieval Europe to unite itself and go charging off after the infidels in Jerusalem. But there was something that did. And when the proper propaganda was deployed, their hearts soared the way our heart soars when we watch a rocket launch with a new technology to deploy satellites to bring the internet to sub-Saharan Africa. And all these people will finally be able to share in the World Wide Web of knowledge. And we go, the dream, it's the dream. There it is. Let's all get up and do the thing. You know, there's that call, knowing what that call is part of knowing who we are. Phil and then Stephen, and then Buddy, you had your hand up. I won't forget.
Yeah, this brings up really the whole notion of the ontological difference and its manifestation, you know. And it's a very complex relationship. But for now, I'll pare it down in this sense. You know, the ontological difference is really difference between the ideas. So that's why I mean limited and experience, or what you will call existence.
Yeah.
And Merleau-Ponty says something rather incredible. He says, we know not through our intellect, but through our experience. We must therefore rediscover after the natural world, the social world, not objects or sum of objects, but as a primitive field or dimension of experience. I would say a dimension of existence, right? And so he's presenting the other view, is that difference between ideas and existence that has the gap that we have to fill in, right? And I think the problem is that in modernity, as we present it, the ideas on top and really experience is sort of, how should I say, the appearances. Mm-hmm. And so therefore, you know, like, and this shows it up so much about you when you said about authority. You could see it clearly when Trump was at the podium and Dr. Fauci was standing by the side, right? Dr. Fauci actually at least knows more than Trump. But the authority has to overrule the knowledge, right? So therefore, in the same way, when you go to war nowadays, I think it was more honest back in the old day, you know, like, oh, we want to conquer that kingdom because we want the goodies. So they were at least honest about it. And war was an instrument for self-benefit. We now all also understand that actually is what it is, but we have to present it in terms of an idea that will cover over the actual thing,
right? Rather
than just being honest. So we are more, in a sense, deceitful, because we're not saying, you know, because we want the goodies. It's just because, oh no, there are these dangers, and so therefore you have to like present a idea that covers over the real idea, is that you actually want the good stuff, you know. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And this comes back to something that was interesting when I was at Penn State. You know, I actually was exposed to, in a way, existentialism through Alfonso Lingus. And I found it very, very strange that it was difficult for me to understand. Alfonso Lingus started as a Kant scholar. So he was a scholar of ideas. And I did not I could not figure out how he became a scholar of Heidegger, because it seemed so different to me at that time, right? How did he move from that to this? And I think he moved, now that I understand it better, I think he moved that way because he understood that there was an ontological difference. And so he wanted to bridge the gap. You know, he moved from Kant to Heidegger to Emmanuel Levinas, right? Which is about care. And so that was interesting. But nonetheless, during that time, you know, I first started painting fallen angels. And this actually goes back to what Sharon says. The fundamental problem is that there is something wrong with our human beings. Remember, that was the time when I came home and said to my roommate, I discovered the missing link. The missing link is mankind. Because mankind has the idea of being human, but we can't seem to be there. It's a developmental process. We're stuck in the pace of mankind, which means that we have this dark side of wanting things for ourselves. And yet we do have these ideals, at least some of us, that are striving to be human beings, have these ideas that there is something better about otherness as well. And we know that we're fallen. At least we know that we're fallen, because we can't quite get there, because we want to do that, but on the other hand, we don't want to do that because we are also selfish, right? But at least we recognize that. Many people do not even recognize that.
Yeah.
And so therefore, they do not even see the ontological difference.
Yeah.
At least we do. And we're trying to, once we do, then we at least have the hope of aspiring to become truly human as close as possible. That's a difficult task in itself, because we are driven by greed and selfishness to a certain degree. And that difference is what we have to, in a sense, come to see and come to know and come to I say, make real in the world. And that's why I have fallen angels, because they have wings. They want to fly to become human, but they're grounded. They're grounded. They can't fly. They're birds without wings, and with wings, but they can't fly. There are such birds, by the way. And so I think the first important step is to be able to see the difference between the ideas and its manifestation. And I think once you recognize that, you know, then you begin to feel at least some guilt that you're not there, because you realize that you have not achieved it, right? Yes. And so whereas if you do not even recognize that difference, then you are never going to feel guilty, right? You just did what you wanted. Yes. And that would be honest in a way, you know, but so in some sense, you know, I find people who are that way to be more honest, at least, even though they're even further fallen. They haven't even arrived. Let's say they haven't even begun to grow the wings. So I think that this is very important, is how do you actualize the ideas or the ideals, let's put it that way, and have it manifest in the world.
Yes.
Because you care about the world, you care about others, and you care about nature as well, which is a very, very important thing to do. So recognition first, you know, you begin to see into yourself to a certain degree. That's all I wanted to say for now. But I will certainly get back to the ontological difference.
But of course. Thank you, Phil. Yeah, the striving to do better, to be drawn beyond what we are at the moment, what we're doing at the moment, to say that my goal and my affect shouldn't be merely self-satisfaction and taking pride, you know, but also the recognition that there should be better in the world, that we should strive to do better, that this isn't a stopping place. This isn't a triumphant jumping up and down saying, yay, we won place. It's easy to imagine better than this. One doesn't have to go as far as perfect utopias, right? We're not talking about utopianism. We're talking about, can people be motivated to strive to do better, to recognize that we are not at the beginning and not at the end, but in an in-between state, that there is more that we could do, and that the difference between where we are and that more that we could actually do would make a difference in the world. That a number of the problems that we face come from not having reached far enough into those directions. We were complacent about things we shouldn't be complacent about. We just accept things that we ought to change. Kenneth Smith talks about, when you're critiquing modernity, one of the things you have to watch for is the ways in which one of the characteristics, especially of mid to late stage modernity, is the pacification, the mass pacification. So many ways to teach us not to try, not to strive, not to rock the boat, not to disrupt people's conflicts of interests. It's the great goal is certain people with power have what they want, and that what they want more than anything is for us not to mess with it. We're supposed to just shut up, sit down, consume, produce, vote, but otherwise leave everything alone. Don't think that we can do better than this, because that would be wrong. And this is where the law of the excluded middle comes in. If you believe that we could get water to Flint, Michigan, if you believe that we could have, a fairer voting system, if you believe anything could be improved, even incrementally, you're accused of being utopian. Oh, you're just a crazy dreamer. What insanity. All evil comes from utopians. You're the cause of all evil. Wanting to get water to Flint, Michigan, that's just, you're just like Hitler. It's like we have these absolutizing ways of shaming people for wanting to make things better.
When I was younger, actually after college, there was a period of time when quite often, I wouldn't say every night, but quite often I had this dream. Those are the only dreams I remember vividly, of flying.
Yeah.
I'm flying and flying. I'm flying. It's really, really hard. I really am so tired and exhausted. I try to get up high, but I could never quite break through the clouds.
Yeah.
I'm trying so hard, and the experience was the difficulty of doing it. And then I would never get there. And it was a very interesting precursor of what I actually was. I recognized that in my dreams. And then that became, more recognized in the real world, in a sense, in consciousness. But it's very interesting. The problem is that, when you exist in the world, and when you have kind of at least those dreams and hopes, then, you try to help. For instance, the last election, I gave a lot of money, throughout to many candidates, and especially to try to win the Senate. And I think I got pegged like, this is the guy that will give money. And so you couldn't believe how many people kept asking for money, because they have marked me, because that's a marker that here is a sucker who will give money, right? And I got to a point where and in fact, somebody that represented Nancy Pelosi says, they threatened to eliminate me from the list. Right. And I finally, after a while, I finally wrote back and says, why don't you have Nancy contribute something in my name? Because I don't have the sort of money she has, because I haven't been engaged in insider trading.
Yes.
And so you see the hypocrisy even on the side that I support, right? Yeah. Yeah. Because what they want is to see you only as an object to give money,
Right.
not as a human being. The kind of disrespect the system has for you on either side is that you are just a resource, a trading value. And so that was an insult. And I finally said, you know, I have something better to do with my money, to give it to Ukraine, because they are actually fighting for democracy. They are actually dying for democracy. So therefore, I'm going to give them money. You know, what money I would have given to you, if you hadn't hassled me, I'm going to give to them, you know, until then. So the problem is that even when you're trying to be good, you're interfered by other people who have different motives.
Yes.
Can I just say very quickly that the scenario that Phil just described is an essential part of the culture. You're not human, you're an object,
Yes.
even in the workplace.
Yes.
And the second thing I want to say to Phil, on the humorous side, in the early 1970s, Bob Marley made a song which said, "If I had the wings of a dove, I would fly away and be at rest. But since I have no wings, I am going to sing, sing, sing." So if you look it up, it's got a catchy beat and nice words.
Nice.
And you talk about flying and having wings, so I kind of put it all together.
Thank you.
Sharon. Yeah, Kenneth Smith cites Kafka and Dostoevsky a lot as significant influences. Going back to this motif of, you know, the importance of art and literature and other non-systematic mathematical scientific modes of philosophy. And Kafka, of course, is constantly giving us dehumanizing systems that don't make sense. Or rather, they make sense in their own terms, but not in any terms that are fulfilling in any way for actual human beings. And you know, what you were describing with the way that you just got dogpiled on by people who saw you as a money source. It reminds me of, it was just this last week, a friend his father passed away, and he says he made the mistake of Googling coffins to see what the state of the art is, what's out there. And ever since then, you know, they ended up buying a coffin for his father and they held the funeral. He says, ever since, relentlessly on Facebook and everywhere else, he's bombarded with advertisements for coffins that just won't leave him alone. They just know that if this sucker was going to buy one coffin, surely he'll buy 20. And if they could all just get into him before his eyes and constantly show him coffins, it's going to lead to, you know, wealth, right? Victory for all these corporations that are desperate to sell a coffin. And it underscores the extent to which modernity is structured around very non-human things. That the schemas that we create, that we say are the best possible ways to meet human needs, in fact, are the best possible ways to meet inhuman needs. They satisfy their own systematic algorithms with no regard whatsoever for whether they're satisfying the purpose that they ostensibly exist for. You know, it's raining coffins. I grieved my dad. We had a funeral, and now the coffins just won't stop. It's coffins everywhere I look. Is something that never would have happened, not only in the two other epochs that Kenneth writes about in this book. It never would have happened in the medieval world. It never would have happened in the ancient world. But I'm confident in saying there was never any other culture in the history of the world before modernity that was so systematized, algorithmicized, intellectualized, mathematized, that someone after a funeral for their father would just be dogpiled on by coffin salesmen. It just, this is us, right? This is who we are. Bye, buddy. We'll see you next time. It's such a modern thing to do. And it goes to the heart of who we are. And the thing is, before we develop a taste for philosophy, which modernity doesn't want us to do, before we develop a taste for modernity, we note these things and laugh at them, but then we suppress them, right? They make a good joke or a good story, but then our powers of nescience our unconscious powers of nescience have to convert them into lacunae and make them do the foreground background operation, shove them into the background. So we stop thinking about them and then they disappear and are erased. And that way, the modern trained mind can recreate a picture of the world in which the promises of modernity are coming true, right? Our job, whether we like it or not, as moderns, as modern thinkers, our job is to reinterpret the world in such a way that it proves that modernity is correct. We don't know that's our job. We don't know that's what we were trained for. But when you watch the operation of the modern mind, you can see it busily every minute of every day, and especially when we're asleep, busily erasing out of the picture all of the things that make modernity look stupid. We can embrace them long enough to enjoy them, but then they have to go away, right? And go into the memory hole that George Orwell wrote about. And they have to become unfacts so that we are left with a world in which the promises of modernity can come true. And if we just keep fighting to do the same things that all our previous modernist revolutionaries did, well, this time it will surely work, because all of the evidence to the contrary, we have all forgotten together. Stephen, and then we'll go to the text.
Yeah, well, you look at the post-World War II history. Post-World War II was when America emerged as a great world power, the complete controller and centre of finance, and that's where America's power is based, is controlling most of the world's finance.
Right.
And so America got the idea that its vision must be the one that works. And Hume always pointed out that sometimes things go well for us purely by accident.
Yes.
It's a bit like Sylvester the cat, when a panther escapes, and usually the big dog that's going to bully Sylvester, he's cringing in the corner. He doesn't see the panther's arm that comes out and slices the dog to bits. And Sylvester the cat gets the idea that he's super cat.
Right.
And
right.
yeah, it's this is a thing that the West thought it was so successful, it must be right, and the other guy has to be wrong.
Yes.
But you know, the recent thing you notice was so much in the press, is that so many politicians have gone outside their role and are psychoanalyzing Vladimir Putin.
Right.
Now, if I was a politician, that's the last thing I'd be doing. I'd leave it for the pundits on YouTube.
Right. Right.
I would just stick with the facts. And yeah, there's this tendency to paint Putin as Hitler, as the new Hitler. They're trying to re-invoke. It's a bit like the film Idiocracy, where their whole worldview is stuck with the end of World War II. And they figured they must have done something right for defeating the UN defeated the Nazis, and that was where the world of idiocracy was stuck. And yeah, it's I saw that whole trip with Bush Jr., that he figured that he could go into the Middle East, and well, this has been the trip. The Americans had the view that we'll go into Vietnam, we'll go here. Everywhere there's an American just screaming to get out, and we only have to take the stop off the bottle, and the Americanism will come out in Vietnam and come out in Iraq. And
that's right.
And the whole world press has got this attitude. Can't you see, Vladimir, that we're all just in one big love fest together, singing Kumbaya?
Uh-huh.
I wonder, just how does it look to Russia? You know,
Yes.
Putin's there. I was talking with this Ukrainian guy a couple of years ago, and he was saying, "Oh, you got to remember this Putin guy is pretty dangerous." And I was thinking, there I am, Putin. I'm sitting in Moscow. I've got NATO in the Baltic states. I mean, this guy's hearing NATO drum under his bed all day,
Yes.
and quite rightfully so.
Yes.
And just this whole trip that the whole Western press is just justifying their own position,
Right.
adding to their own blindness. It's the gospel. It's Jesus saying, well, you guys have got to understand, don't tell the other guy you're blind when you're blind as well.
Right. Right.
And yeah, we're seeing an unfurling tragedy, because the question is, what's behind it all? Who are the vested interests that are involved?
Mm-hmm.
Who's going to make a profit out of this?
These are the things we don't like to talk about, and yet this is
this is just one bit of information. They're painting the Russians as absolute monsters. The claim is they've claimed that they've had Ukraine has had 700 civilian dead and something like about 1,400 casualties, and they say, well, there must be more. But this cannot be a Russia that's gone into Ukraine, which is indiscriminately shelling civilians. You're not going to get a casualty of about theoretically 2,000 or possibly more if Russia is indiscriminately shelling everything that they're coming across.
Right. Right.
It's like my old friend has said, when Iraq, when America was doing Saddam, Saddam invaded the other countries, and my old leftist friend would say, I haven't heard the bit where they've hit the children's hospital yet, but we always get that one.
Right. Sooner or later, it'll go on the list, right? We have a checklist of atrocities, and we trot them out in order to drum up the sense of the inhumanization. How impossibly evil and scapegoaty are the other guys to justify what we want to do. Yeah, there is a long, nasty history around NATO relations with Russia and around US relations with the Soviet Union around the end of the Cold War, all of which are going into what's happening right now in Russia and Ukraine. But to talk about the nuances of how this all happened and whether it could have been avoided, that flies in the face of the law of the excluded middle. We don't want that nuance. We want to feel that we are the most objective without actually being the most objective. We don't want to suffer for objectivity. And that certainly includes not looking at ourselves in the mirror and saying, what did we do to the Soviet Union, Russia, over the last 40 years to get them into this state? Mm-hmm. How much money did we spend through the CIA and the NSA, through foreign relations and so forth, in order to break down society as far as we could in Russia, in the belief that it would lead to good things? And the idea that it could cause the rise of, a violent criminal kind of style of rule where you could have mafiosi holding the reins of government in a nuclear power was completely foreseeable, but not something we ever wanted to admit we were causing to happen, right? Why did we support this guy over that guy? Well, U.S. has a long history of overthrowing democratically elected governments and replacing them with strongmen. And, look, there's a strongman in Russia. Is it possible that we had a hand in his rise to power somewhere along the way? Well, that's not something we want to talk about right now. And what about the Ukraine? What's been the last 40 years of history in the Ukraine? What has the United States been doing in the Ukraine up until now? Are there any reasons why Ukraine and Russia might be angry at each other right now that might have anything to do with what our country has been doing in Russia and the Ukraine? Well, we don't want to talk about that either. And like Stephen alluded to, NATO, during the dissolution of the Soviet Union, NATO ostensibly was created for specific targeted reasons. And so we made deals with the Soviet Union about not spreading NATO beyond a certain extent so that Russia wouldn't feel threatened. And that would bring us peace. But what did we do? We went exactly to the countries that we swore we would never recruit for NATO, and we recruited them for NATO. And so Russia's looking at more and more and more countries creeping closer to its borders, all joining this alliance that ostensibly exists in order to break up Russia. Well, what's Putin supposed to do? He's a nuclear power. And I'm not excusing anything he's doing. I'm not. I'm saying it's a complicated, messy picture. And we have our hands very dirty in what's going on in these countries. But at times like this, we never want to admit it. And we may think that that's human nature, to not want to admit what you've done wrong, but just read Thucydides. In the Peloponnesian War, they were constantly doing things and saying they did them. So are they not human? Or is human nature have more possibilities than moderns give it credit? Is it possible to be human in more different ways than we can imagine? Things that we think are completely impossible, might they have been the norm for hundreds of thousands of years? Is it possible that we are an aberration, a very strange form of culture that doesn't have any business talking about the possibilities of what people can and can't be, because we would be the last to know? Now, these thoughts are unthinkable. Modernity says, utopianism, that's all crazy talk. If you say that we're not normal, if you say people can be any better than us, you're insane. You're out of the discussion. You're not reliable. And in order to support that position, we carefully don't teach the history, any of the history that would suggest we might be wrong about what human nature is. So the point of all this really is to bring it back to the text and say, what we're seeing in here is he's talking about the extent to which even the people who think that they're the wisest and the most enlightened and the most objective are heavily shaped by their cultures to reinterpret and misinterpret the world in the ways that those cultures prefer. And that certainly applies to us. Fill in the text.
Yeah, we just missed a golden opportunity after Gorbachev. We should have been more engaged with Russia, because it was at the moment when they were ready to be more open, and we didn't do enough. And in fact, I think we were just living through the memory of choking them off more and more.
Right.
And I think that was a mistake, to the point that, like, what are they supposed to do? They needed help. We should have given them help and bring them into a degree of alignment with us, but we didn't do that. I mean, I'm sorry that Gorbachev sort of went down, but Yeltsin was still okay. I mean, he's a bit of a fool, but I think his heart was at the right place. And if he needed some help, then we wouldn't have had Putin to begin with.
Yeah. Hoist on our own petard, right? The story of Oedipus Tyrannus is not that he violated the norms of his society, but that the things that he wanted to avoid more than anything, he instead did through his own efforts, unknowingly. And the things that he wanted to achieve more than anything else, he failed at through his own efforts. His diligent, relentless efforts were doing the opposite of what he thought they were doing. This is the condition that the tragedians talk about extensively. Tragic inversion. Tragic inversion is a condition of life in which your strengths turn into weaknesses, because the more you succeed at doing the things you set out to do, the worse things turn out. That there is this irony to life when we are out of sync with how the world really is, when we act according to misinterpretations of ourselves and the world, then the best qualities we have can cause the worst outcomes. When you're in a hole, stop digging. The first thing to do if you want to get out of a hole is to stop digging the hole deeper. We say that as a throwaway joke, but this goes back to the tragedians. When you're in that stage of a tragedy in which you've got tragic inversion at work, you have to stop and reevaluate everything to figure out how you got here. Because if you don't, if you just keep reapplying the old solutions, you're going to keep deepening the problems. And this is where we find ourselves in late stage modernity. But what the Greeks didn't fully appreciate, perhaps, but that the object lessons of the medieval and modern worlds have demonstrated, is that it goes worse than that. You can even get yourself into a condition in which some people know that digging the hole is making things worse, and they know it's going to end badly for everybody, but it's not out of ignorance. They still can't stop digging because the perverse incentives are just too great. They have to keep digging. You know, I think about that email from the Exxon execs saying, we believe our scientists say that our industry might be destroying the possibility of human life on Earth. We may be destabilizing the very things that make it possible for our civilization to exist. But we are making more money than we've ever made before. This is the most profitable sector, the most profitable industry in the world. And we just can't stop. We can't. And you might think it's some kind of aberration, but we have similar emails from tobacco executives when they were saying, at this point, it is absolutely a given fact that we are killing an enormous number of people every year through lung cancer and associated diseases. And that's wrong, but we can't stop ourselves because the money's just too good. We just have to keep doing it. And both of these, people talk about it. We can at times recognize the corruption of the profit motive, but where it gets really painful is when we come to understand that you don't even need a profit motive for this. It's like we talked about last week. During times of chaos and confusion, when we don't understand what to do, when our worldview has not prepared us for the circumstances that we've entered. And because of that, we would have to rethink everything and come up with a new interpretation of reality. The vast majority of people under modernism, which is so deeply anti-philosophical, cannot do it. They can't question their beliefs and their habits and their ways of life, even if there's no profit involved. Instead, while there's a catastrophe taking place, they all go about their lives as though it's not happening, because acting out the routines and rituals and habits is all they have left as a strategy for life. What we see going on with, the tobacco executives and the Exxon executives, it's easy to scapegoat them. And it's easy to scapegoat the profits involved. But I think we get closer to understanding the human condition if we understand that even without that, there is that problem of, if you have devoted your entire life to excelling in this industry and you get really great at it and you rise to the heights of fame and fortune, only to discover that everything you've worked for is wrong. Unless we've prepared people with the right kind of culture to be able to handle that psychological and characterological stress, they won't be able to stop themselves. We never gave them the tools they needed. And the reason we never gave them the tools they needed is that we don't want the gravy train to stop. We're so afraid of anarchists and revolutionaries and chaos that we have worked very hard to pacify people and to make them fit in and to not rock the boat. And so all of these are related conditions. This is the over-systematization of human life and the suppression of human creativity to the point that we are just not competent to rise to the very challenges that we're creating for ourselves in the world.
I might add at this point, there's something that has just been so overlooked in the current situation, and that's where America is going to China, is going to Iran, and even Venezuela, and saying, hey, you guys, this Putin guy is really bad. Join us in defeating him. And this is the whole fallout of the 2003 Gulf War. There's
Yes.
two elements that normally will not come together. Was the Russians and the Chinese were so shocked by what went on that they became an alliance. Within
Right.
so many years, we went from a China who was sort of a friend of the US after the 2003 war. It took so many years, a decade, until China had become bitter enemies with the US, and the US didn't even notice.
Right. I mean, the vast majority of Americans have no idea about the global shift that's happened. There was this moment after 2001, after September 11th, where we had the goodwill of almost all the countries in the world just for a moment. People were willing to put aside, many decades of overthrowing small governments around the world, Vietnam, everything else. They looked at what happened at the Twin Trade Centers, and they said, "Oh my God, the pain, the suffering. We're with you. We're all." Paris put up a thing saying we're all Americans tonight, and even countries that had been hostile to us were neutral in that moment, and we're like, "Wow, that's terrible. We're so sorry." And there was this moment where if we'd had a great statesman, right, and a culture of great diplomacy, we could have made enormous strides in foreign relations and world peace towards making a world that we could be more comfortable in. But you see, there had been a plan for decades about taking out Iraq and Afghanistan in order to build pipelines. This had been a plan in the works for a very long time. And the people behind those plans had been waiting and waiting and waiting, and they saw their opportunity and they pounced. And the last thing in the world, they couldn't give a rat's ass about the way that all these other countries looked at us, because they were specialists and they were focused on the problem of getting the pipelines down, through those countries. And so they made sure that the focus was on Afghanistan and Iraq, even though in hindsight, the people behind 2001, they were not actually Iraqis, and they were not the mainstream of Afghanistan either. They were the Afghanis who were Saudis that we trained to fight against the Soviet Union in Afghanistan, that were behind blowing up the World Trade Center. And as all the evidence poured out about that, we tried not to talk about it, even though it was there at the time, because it didn't fit with the program that we had planned for Afghanistan and Iraq. And so what happens is we got what we wanted out of Iraq and Afghanistan thanks to 2001, but we did it at the price of driving China into the arms of Russia, as Stephen's saying. And thus we shifted the balance of power in the entire world in order for momentary gain in the Middle East. It was really short-sighted. But, moderns have their systems, they have their focus, they have their specialties. Each one is focused on the piece of the picture they're focused on, and they can't stop focusing on it because they've been raised to be specialized creatures. So, it's
well, I guess the financials are worrying,
Yes.
where the present American government believes they can defeat Russia with sanctions, and there is a possibility there, but they're asking the support of a whole list of nations which they've spent time putting sanctions on, to the point where they're saying, "Oh, Iran, if you get on our side, we'll lift some of the sanctions." This might work, but it has a balance of tragedy in it. Will it last?
Right.
This is America. Its strength is it controls the world's financial system, but it's sanctioned so much of the world it doesn't like.
Right.
And now it's asking parts of the world that are sanctioned to join them against Russia economically.
Right.
And just how much give and power does the Fed and the American dollar have? You're really playing, how good is the hands you're playing here?
That's right. That's right. Yeah, and it's something that a lot of Americans don't know, is that Russia and China and Iran and India and many other countries believe that the most important thing to do for world peace is to dislodge the US as the center of finance for the world. Because they look at the way that we use sanctions and the way that we use wars, and they say, look, we do it to everybody. Sooner or later, we don't really have allies. Sooner or later, we turn on everybody and hit them with sanctions if they've got something that we want. And so they're thinking, here is this indebted nuclear power that's running all over the place, misusing its financial power. If we want a peaceful world, we have to pull the teeth of the United States and get to a new economy that's not centered on the US dollar, which backed by the US military. And every time we throw sanctions the way that we do like this, It's an object lesson to all those other countries that confirms that, yeah, they need to unite against us and figure out how to change the world financial system to get us out of the middle of it. Because only then can they expect to, experience peace from their perspective. We're financially dangerous. But if you read the New York Times and the Washington Post and any other mainstream media you can, you're not going to read a whole bunch of analyses talking about the way the world looks at us and how it's changing as a result of the things that we're doing. We educate our own population and inform them in these very caricatured, oversimplified ways that cause us to be endlessly surprised by world event after world event after world event that everybody else saw coming except for us. Sharon and then Phil. Go ahead, Sharon. Oh, you're on mute. You're still on mute. Yay, okay.
I wanted to back up,
please,
to what you're saying and what Stephen is saying about the way we in America see ourselves, because I'm going back to the text here, and Kenneth Smith makes a comparison to the Greeks, and I will just read it. He says, not all forms of civilization have the resources that enable the Greeks to grasp the profound metabolism or synergetic order underlying human, no less than natural existence. And this sentence I think is key. The Greeks' philosophical intelligence was a function of their intuitive sense of what made anything organic or internally coherent, governed by authoritative archai or principles. Yes. And I think that's probably what you're saying we're lacking. Yes. Without such a sense, there could be neither community nor tradition, culture nor individual character. For existence is rife with chaotizing factors that cause ill-framed actions to miscarry, ill-architected institutions to defeat their original purposes, ill-cultivated languages and literatures to generate confusion and conflict, which is where I think we are, rather than clarity and consonance. And I think those couple of sentences kind of summarize the discussion that you're having. Yes. So we don't have the intuitive sense because we're lacking philosophical intelligence. Is that the way I should interpret that?
Yes. Yes, we're lacking philosophical intelligence, but we're also lacking a culture that's capable of producing characters. We have an anti-culture that instead is used the way that a carny is used to separate people from their money, right? The whole thing is full of con games at this point. You know, how many home loans are predatory or primarily designed not to get people into housing, but to keep them in debt for the rest of their lives?
Correct.
You know, the extent to which the university system has been converted into that. People are graduating with a lifetime of debt. The medical system has been converted into that, a great debt factory. You know, if anything significant happens to you, that's it for the rest of your life. You're never going to be economically free again. And this has all been done with an eye towards short-term gain, but it's done in a way that perverts these institutions to the point that they're eventually defeating their actual purpose. You know, we are not ending up with the educated population that we need. We are not ending up with everybody having a home and therefore not having to resort to criminal behavior out of desperation just to live. Where, you know, you can go through all the list of the institutions and you'll find that we've hollowed them out in order to, you know, in order to pursue profit. So what we have is an anti-culture rather than a culture. And as a result, it can produce personalities, but it can't produce character. And without character, people don't have any capacity to unite.
Yes.
To do the right thing. The final sentence of that paragraph is the real punchline. All life is organic, a music, an activity of the muses, inspired by a coordinating logos that is neither conscious nor voluntary.
Oh,
Now,
you gotta explain that.
Yeah, he's not using the word logos here in an intellectualized, rationalized way. He's using the word logos here the way that Heraclitus used it. Heraclitus was relentless in using the word logos. And for him, the logos is the logic of the cosmos that we don't understand, but that makes everything work. It's the intelligence by which all things are steered through all things. It's the hidden harmony that makes everything go. All of this reference, anytime in Kenneth Smith you see a reference to music and coordination and logos, it's Heraclitus. Because Heraclitus was very crisp on these topics. He said, the things that we can see in the world are important, but they're not as important as the things that we can't see that create the things that we see. And to really understand nature, that's the level we have to understand it at. What is this hidden harmony that coordinates the activities of the pollinators and the pollen, right? I'm doing gardening right now. I got mason bees, and they're sleeping right now in their cocoons, and I'm busily running around the garden trying to put in plants that are going to flower at the same time that these bees wake up, because they've only got a month. You know, they're only alive and awake and out of their little cocoons for a month, and they frantically pollinate, and then they lay their eggs, and then that's it, they die. And the rest of the life cycle is, you know, the little eggs hatching with the pollen and the nectar and these little dark cells, and they grow up to full size inside a tiny little cell, and they weave a cocoon and they go to sleep for 10 months. And when they wake up, there had better be pollinatable plants. Because if there's not, their whole life falls apart. Everything depends on this interrelationship for them.
I'll send you my mango trees.
Oh, I wish we could grow mangoes up here. I adore them.
I'm just kidding.
But you know, but that's what he's talking about here, is this coordination among many, many, many things is what creates the possibilities of life. And the coordination isn't done through laws and force and coercion. You could never make enough laws or build enough armies to force everything to do the right thing. The world's too complicated. Nobody can make a plan that good. Most things have to be coordinated unconsciously, creatively, by sharing certain principles and patterns, so that when they go about solving problems, each in their own way, they nevertheless all happen to line up together and reinforce each other. This is the hidden harmony that Heraclitus is talking about, and that Kenneth is talking about here. He says, if people have genuine characters, those characters are full of principles and virtues that will make them solve any problem that could come along, but solve them in compatible ways. And from that, they generate a culture, and the culture can raise a new generation of people that have the same character. And so this is a way of not Xerox stamping out people according to an ideology or a curriculum, but of creating creative, humane people who are able to make a civilization that is resilient, because it can identify problems, even problems it wasn't prepared for. It's got the creative impulse in it, the spirit to identify problems, and the courage, which is among the virtues, to be willing to confront those problems and wrestle the civilization into a new shape that solves them. And when you get rid of all that for short-term advantage, when you suppress that creative impulse, that spirit of striving and improving, because it creates a status quo that preserves your bank account at the moment, it comes at the cost of making a civilization that isn't prepared to handle any crisis that it isn't programmed for. And because it's an anti-culture, it's constantly generating crises. It's the definition of an anti-culture, is instead of generating solutions, it generates crises. It has short-term solutions and long-term crises. And the consequences of that are exactly what we read about in Oedipus Tyrannus. The workings of such a culture, in its attempt to solve problems, generate the next generation of problems that it itself is least prepared to be able to solve. Of all the problems in the world it could generate, it isn't going to generate the ones it can solve. It's going to generate the ones that it can't solve.
That's correct.
And this is one of the ironies that Hegel talks about. How is it that dysfunctional personalities and dysfunctional cultures so perfectly align that they create their own destruction? They don't just toddle along, you know, making the kinds of problems they're familiar with, but the thing that they can innovate on best is in those blind spots and ill-prepared areas. So when he talks about discriminating between virtues and vices, or between a value and a vanity, and so forth, for a modern, these are all just words. We might look at a dictionary to figure out what they mean, or we might ask our friends, but they don't particularly mean anything to us more profound than the word apple or the word gross domestic product. They're terms that are co-equal with all other terms and of no deeper significance. We don't have a hierarchy of values in which we understand that some things are the very fundament of life that must be cherished and protected at all costs, whereas other things are sort of add-ons that you could take or leave. We don't have that idea, except at a personal, idiosyncratic way. But to the Greeks, values and virtues and character and culture were more important than all the other stuff. And the idea that they would sabotage deliberately a culture in order to make a buck, that's a modern thing. An ancient Greek never could have done that. That's not their value system. They were constructed by their culture. They were raised by their culture in such a way that some things that were unthinkable to them are not only thinkable, but normal to us, and vice versa.
Is that with the Greek aristocrats, or is it with the Greek, all of Greeks were like that, do you think, Rick? Because I'm hearing from the meetings I've gone to where Greeks actually were carnivores even. I mean, I'm not carnivores. What do you call it?
The predatory. Yeah.
No.
Yeah, there's, it's not that the Greeks are better than we are, objectively better. It's not that they got everything right and we got everything wrong. They got lots of things wrong that helped to contribute to the collapse of their civilization. What's illuminating for us is seeing the things that they got right sometimes and wrote about that we almost never get right and almost never even think about. And when we can start to trace enormous numbers of our modern catastrophes to those very blind spots, those things that we don't think about or talk about, then we start to see how it is that it's possible for us to be sending rockets up to launch satellites and to plan for a mission to Mars at the same time we can't get clean water to Flint, Michigan. How can these be true at the same time? And it's in studying these contrasts that it begins to come into focus. And the way that it comes into focus is by changing our understanding of ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
Many of the things we think about modernity are not true. And many of the things we think about ourselves as modern people are not true. And when we understand that, then we finally begin to understand the shape of the problem we're facing, and we can start to come up with realistic solutions. That's that painful process of self-enlightenment is what opens the door to the possibility of actually solving problems.
So they're talking about the Greek power structure here, the ruling class, the aristocrats, the behavior and the mindset behind the ruling class, the philosophical intelligence, which gave them this intuitive sense, which is probably missing in our political structure.
Right. Yeah, I mean, a Greek aristocrat could expect to be on the front lines of war, just like in the medieval era. A king or a noble could expect to be on the front lines of war. If you study martial arts, there are a lot of ways in which they change you, because there are things that you will do if you are never at risk, but you are allowed to put other people at risk, that you would never do if you yourself had to be the one at risk. It changes your value system. It has to. And it can even do so in an empty, mechanical, modern Darwinian way, because the people who don't develop courage and judicious assessment of risk, they die quickly and are the only ones that are left are the ones who don't, who do develop, a judicious assessment of risk. There's a process of elimination that happens, and it's part of the reason why in the modern world people who lack those virtues but want to stay in power are very careful to insulate themselves from ever putting themselves to the test, because that way they can go on being who they are now, which is what they want, and not have to transform into the sort of people who are actually fit to rule.
Okay.
Phil, you got your
Thank
hand up.
you.
Sure, Sharon.
Thank you, Rick, for giving me an opportunity to talk about Artemis.
I
Because
love
that's what
Artemis.
that's what you did. I mean, the truth about Artemis is that she understands that truth, or you would say nature, both is, how to say, uncovering or disclosing itself, but also concealing itself.
Yes.
Which means truth is incomplete, and therefore the origin of thinking, if you want to go back to the origin of thinking, is that you have to think further and further and further because it's incomplete. It's always opening. And therefore, in a sense, truth must, on some level, depend on creativity as well. Remember, Artemis is the goddess of the hunt, chasing for truth, but she's also the muse of the arts.
Yes.
Which reveals in the arts that it shows you something, but it also is incomplete. It shows you the incompleteness. So therefore, when you come to it, you have to understand, in a sense, that you have to think about it more to add to the thing itself. That is what creativity is about.
Yes.
And the problem, however, is that Artemis is the sister of Apollo.
Yes.
So here we have the difference between the pre-Socratics and the classical Greeks, right? Because Apollo presumably is the higher god. And Apollo is already cut off from, in a sense, life itself,
Yes.
existence, right?
Yes.
Because Apollo wanted to extract what Artemis gave her and reduce it down to intellect, which is complete. That is actually the beginning, you know? And so, in a sense, then once you do that, then we have this, in a sense, funny situation where the hiddenness is secluded in the identity, from the identity. And then we have the problem of the causal chain. Okay. And that what flashed me into this is to remind me of, like, what caused 9/11? Well, is Osama bin Laden, right?
Right.
That's the cause.
At the cause.
And we focus on that.
Yes.
But then you could say, well, what caused Osama bin Laden and the Taliban? And you say, the Mujahideen, what we supported, right?
Yes.
And what caused that? Because the Russian wanted to invade Afghanistan to establish a beachhead. And then you will say, what caused that? Because Russia, I mean, the Soviet Union at that time, was both an expansionist nature, but also wanted to secure a defensive position.
Right.
So you already have this confusion about what actually caused,
Yes.
the ramming of the World Trade Center. And when you look at only the near perspective to the cycle, of course, you're going to pin it on Osama bin Laden, right? Okay. Of course, you trace it back further, and that why did Osama bin Laden come? Because we aided the what? Saudi Arabia and he was sort of excluded from that society because he was a kind of a radical. So he had to find some other thing. So there are many, many causes that we can't explain because you want to ask what really caused it. It was really actually colonialism that really caused it. It's just so complex. So when you give a simple cause, the immediate cause, then you it's putting it incomplete. So there's always a problem of tracing cause back to the original cause, whatever that might be, probably the Big Bang.
Right. That's where we went wrong.
Which is the problem, right? So therefore, in a sense, if you want to think about why we're trapped in this, is Exxon could have thought about it more and understood the cause was much more complex than the immediate profit, right? And so we're caught in a near perspective that doesn't allow us to expand the ambiguity, the hiddenness from the totality. And so therefore we are motivated by what is there, but not motivated by what is there, but we do not see, the hiddenness. And so I think that Artemis at least understood that. And maybe Artemis shouldn't hand over her findings to Apollo. Because I think, and I think that's the point. And that's why one of the things about Artemis as the muse of the arts is central to culture to sustain our understanding that there is ambiguity in the hiddenness that we do not see. Or at least we cannot trace all the way back to the Big Bang. I mean, so therefore you have to have this sensitivity that actually thinking itself must embody the hiddenness that we want to uncover, and not the system that we have already uncovered and said, aha, that is the original cause. No, it isn't. It's just the result. And the problem with that is then once you understand that, once you go out and move into this near cause, it causes other things to happen. Which causes another causal chain, which is very, very problematic. So we are living in this sort of state of ambiguity that we do not admit that we are in. And so that's why I really, really like Artemis, even though she's perhaps a minor god compared to Apollo, because she actually got it right.
It's amazing how many meetings I've gone to last year and a half where we talked about Oedipus, Rex, and all that. And I'm thinking, did Sophocles and Aeschylus, these guys, ever imagine that their plays would be talked about thousands of years later? It's amazing.
They hoped. They hoped. They dreamed.
I mean, all the playwrights, and writers throughout history, and that whom we don't refer to or talk about, and yet we talk about Sophocles' plays and Aeschylus' plays still.
And the problem is we're not even wanting to fund the education and the arts, and we have turned art almost primarily into exchange of money. Exclude me from that, please. Because I hate that market system. But nonetheless, there's still true art that exists that is not merely an exchange of appearances.
So, Artemis and Apollo, right? Gnosis and Noesis, effectively. And Artemis seems to us like a minor goddess because we disrespect Gnosis. We scapegoat it as subjectivity and claim that it's the source of all irrationality and therefore of all evil. And so we don't recognize Artemis as being about that. We say, oh, she's pretty much like Selene, so she, or Diana, she must be the goddess of the moon, right? She's about the moon. And maybe astronauts going to the moon will think about Artemis, but the rest of the time we don't have to worry about it. And then we learn, oh, I guess she's also the goddess of hunting, so maybe hunters will pay some attention. And if you dig further, you're like, well, maybe childbirth too, so maybe that matters. But what do they all have in common? You know, what is this about? It's about the organic structure of the laws of nature, right? And the kind of human mental capacity that's capable of comprehending that cyclic organic nature of things. This is the real Artemis underneath it all. And it's why Heraclitus would deposit his masterpiece at the great temple of Artemis rather than at the temple of Apollo. So he's like, you know, I'm trying to help an overly noetic, overly logos culture remember the importance of the other half of how we see the world, because without that we don't have a chance. I mean, these 4 quotes, these are 4 fragments from Heraclitus I shared. Nature loves to hide, that one gets shared. But then 18 is so important. The Lord whose oracle is at Delphi, that's Apollo, right? Neither speaks nor conceals, but gives signs. In other words, he directly contradicts the previous statement, but then he works it into a paradox. And he's saying it is not the purpose of nature. It is not the duty of nature to explain itself to us in terms that we can understand. There are signs all around us that can suggest what's really going on underneath the surfaces of things. But if we are too literal minded and we insist on assuming that things are the way that they look, then we're never really going to understand the world. And that's why he says, unless you expect the unexpected, you will never find the truth, for it's hard to discover and hard to attain. The pursuit, epistemology, the pursuit of what's true is a lifelong pursuit, and it's a difficult pursuit. He's saying that here, right? He's laying out the case for the philosophical life. And in other places, he talks about wisdom is to know the intelligence by which all things are steered through all things, and that wisdom stands apart from all else. It's the most important virtue. And that's what really goes into this when he says the hidden harmony is better than the obvious. He's saying you're never going to be wise if you're always focusing on, you know, what you were taught in school, what's the popular opinion, what does your logic say, what does your math say. That all this stuff is well and good, and you certainly have to learn a lot of things, but you're never going to be wise unless you get under that and figure out what are the deeper principles that create the world that we see, that generate mathematics, that generate logic. What are the more profound roots by which nature organizes herself? And you know, this is the Artemis side, right? Not the Apollo side.
Well, back to Merleau-Ponty, right? It's not about the objects,
yeah,
but the dimension of existence.
Yeah,
the dimension of existence that makes it possible for us to be.
Where is this? I'm going to drop this link in again. I dropped it last week, but I want to drop it again. There it is.
Like 19, number 19.
You like number 19?
That's my favorite.
Yes. So this is why Nora Bateson has a book, and in this case, there's a link to the essay where she coins the term semathesy and says, we talk about systems and systematic thinking as being a big step forward in the 20th century. Before that, we taught too much in the modern world in terms of objects and things, but it doesn't go far enough because systems can be mathematical and intellectual and rational without being true. And so she says, well, what's deeper than systems level thinking? And she says, it's relationships level thinking. The reason we exist is because we exist in a learning relationship with the world around us so that we sense and we adapt and change and respond. And that's what makes an organism an organism. And that's what makes real wisdom and intelligence what they are. Not that we come out with a program and a schema that we've memorized and apply it to the world like a man with a hammer hammering everything as though it's a nail. but that whatever our plans are, and it's good to have plans, we're still alert to what's really going on in the world that doesn't agree with us, so that when we find it, we can change our plan, right? That responsiveness, that dance back and forth, that's somathesy. She says that's what makes living organisms possible. That's why they have all those things at the same time. Yes, they have muscles, or they have the capacity to change the world and act in the world, but they always also have the ability to sense the world, to feel the world, and to respond to the world. Because if you have intention and control, but you don't have sensitivity and alertness, you aren't alive and you'll go wrong. And our problem in modernity is that we are a form of civilization that is not actually alert or sensitive to the world. We're only alert and sensitive to the abstractions that our systems tell us are important, and we suppress everything else. And we do it in a rude, coercive, egotistical way. In the modern world, if you don't pay attention to money, you're screwed. You'll end up homeless. It's not that money is something worth paying attention to. It's thou shalt focus on this thing that we've said is important. And it's not just money. Anything else we said is important, you must focus on those things. It is very different from the Greek approach to religion and to valuing, but it's a lot like the medieval approach, where thou shalt do exactly what the medieval god tells you, or you burn in hell forever, right?
You know, what you're saying, Rick, I keep thinking of Putin because of the times that we're living in right now. It's like, that's the problem with Putin. You know, he's not thinking like what you're saying, Rick.
He's using coercion. He's using coercion to try to get what he wants.
He's a monster. Anyway.
But we use coercion too. We just use coercion in trickier ways in our culture. Why would we make the promise that we wouldn't recruit Eastern Europe into NATO and then turn around and do it anyway? We knew it would happen, right? And by we, I mean the Department of Defense, the CIA, the NSA, the ruling oligarchs in our country. They were trying to arrange, a catastrophe for Russia.
Why would we let Ukraine give up its nuclear weapons? We did that.
Yes, that whole thing is a delicate set of strategies that are being used to try to create the right level of conflict without accidentally slipping into World War III, right? Because we after World War II especially, we optimized our country to be perfectly suited for low-level, endless war. We're not suited, and nobody's suited for a hot nuclear war. But we're also ill-suited to peace. We've been, screwing up all of our peace-oriented institutions. The thing we're really good at is fighting and, insurance and banking. And so we needed there to be conflict, but we needed it to be at a certain level.
Well, when the USSR came about, though, did those different countries, states, became part of USSR in a peaceful, agreeable manner?
Revolutions.
Revolutions.
Yeah, there was a wave of revolutions in the early 20th century, and going back to what Phil was saying about trying to trace causality back and back and back, and anytime we're doing that, we're hearing the echoes of Aristotle warning us. There's the proximate cause, and there's the cause before that, and there's the cause before that. This, Russia was one of the most abusive feudal societies. It was one of the last to modernize, and their treatment of the serfs was horrific. There's a reason why they had a revolution. They pushed things too far, and the counter reaction was equally strong. It's the same if we look at revolutionary France. Why was there guillotines and beheadings in France? Well, the French approach to feudalism was a lot more violent and exploitative than it was in some other countries. And as a result,
the French Revolution was the cult of reason. They were the Enlightenment.
Yes. It was almost the purest form of modernity. They were saying, we're going to use reason to dissect and disassemble our French feudal lords, and we're going to replace things with a new planned society. Right. So when we look at what happened in Eastern Europe and we look at what happened in Russia and why there was a Soviet Union in the first place, those roots go back. Right. The kinds of things that happened in the Slavic countries, the kinds of abuses that happened under feudal lords created generation after generation of, honestly, rage and frustration that had to come out.
Well, the British didn't become a liberal democracy overnight.
Right.
There were centuries.
Right. Anyway, Joseph, then Stephen. Go ahead, Joseph.
Just briefly, when you're talking about systems thinking, I've thought about that quite a bit, and just a little bit lately. And how you were talking about relationship-based thinking, kind of as a way of as being a replacement. What does that exactly? I was wondering if you could expand a little bit on what that would look like, because that's something where I understand that systems kind of ignore the individual. They ignore the actual person themselves. Yes, and that part is clear. That part is clear to me. Right. But I still, it's hard for me to reimagine something now, maybe because I've been, probably the systems have beaten me down into the point where I can't even imagine anything any differently, or I lack imagination or liberal arts education. I don't know any of those three. But in any case, I was just wondering if you could expand a little bit on that.
Sure. So,
and maybe even a small example sense, or it could be on a grand scale.
I'm going to use the VA and their
great
IT program as an example.
That'd be awesome.
So all the VA software during its golden age was written in a programming language called MUMPS. Most people have never heard of it. These days it's called M, but it's basically unknown outside the medical and banking and a few other computer communities. And they chose it because that was its origin. It was actually invented in a hospital by medical people who are struggling with the very weird structure that medical data has. It's like, if you're doing bank accounts, you can lay out the data in predictable ways because everybody who has a banking account, it's got to have a balance. It's got to have, what goes in and what comes out. It's got a name associated with it and a password. The same fields apply to every bank account. They're pretty much the same. And you can have optional plugins, like this person also has investments in the stock market, but those plugins will be the same for everybody who invests in the stock market. So there's a uniformity, and it allows the data to be planned in advance very strongly and to be typed and checked. They all have to be the same. That's how most computer languages of the 60s and 70s did their data management. Everything was very strongly typed. Everything had to be declared up front, and all the records were the same. And if something was empty and you left it, you would leave it blank, or it'd just be full of zeros or spaces or something to take up the space that had been allocated for that field, which was empty. The problem is medicine is the opposite of that. Like, literally no two patients are the same at all. They might both have a name and an insurance card number, but it's probably from a different insurance company, right? So right off the bat, already you're starting to diverge. But some people have polio and other people don't. Some people, catch measles and other people don't. Some people can have babies and other people can't have babies. And no matter where you look in medicine, all the fields you might want to record about a person are different. And they're bewilderingly different. Like, the first people to try to do data planning for medical computer systems, they failed for decades, over and over and over and over, because everything they'd been taught about how you lay out all the fields you're going to need, you allocate all the space. If you did that with medical data, you'd take up the whole hard disk for a single patient for all the things that could possibly go wrong. What if you found a patient who has the measles and mumps and lung cancer and bone cancer and diabetes and he's pregnant, and it's like, the list is so long. If you had to pre-allocate that space, you've just wasted your computer, and it's mostly empty, right? So mumps was originally invented in 1966 by a team of people at Massachusetts General Hospital who said, none of these languages are working for us. We need a language that's really comfortable with having every single piece of Every record could be different from every other record. And we don't know in advance what fields we're going to have. We can't declare everything, and we can't type everything. We've got to deal with masses of text, dictations from doctors in which the medical data is buried in there somewhere. So we have to have text searching capabilities. Are you with me so far? So this is just to give you the sense of why somebody invented a medical programming language. That's why they did it, because medical data is so different. But they didn't teach it in schools, right? It's if you go to to a university curriculum and you come out with a computer science degree, you might learn how to program in C, which everybody learns, but you're not going to come out learning how to program in mumps. So if the VA needs a generation of people, right, we're talking in the 1970s and 80s, who are going to know how to write in the programming language that the system is built out of, where are those people going to come from? Now, in the 70s and 80s, they had an answer. And the answer was, let's think about the relationship. We should create a community. We should create a community that discusses mumps. Let's stand up a mumps standards group that defines the language and comes out with publications that people can read. And let's create a mumps users group. And they're going to have regular meetings, and they'll have a magazine, right, that has articles that people can read. So anybody could start from scratch, join the community. And as a member of the community, they could be trained up by people who are experts, gradually, step by step, and they could learn how to do what the VA needed people to be able to do. They created the relationships, and the relationships created the mumps programmers, and the mumps programmers created the software. They created a whole ecosystem. Now, fast forward to the 1990s. By the mid-1990s, VA had previously been in administration under HHS, and it got promoted under the previous Bush administration to being cabinet level. Well, one thing most Americans don't know about the US government is that being promoted to cabinet level is a sign that it's open season for the Beltway to come predate upon this agency. You now want to send in all of your little agents to take over the positions so that you can steer the contracts to your companies. This is what it means to become a cabinet level agency. It means you're open for business. So a big centralization effort began in the VA, chopping it up, turning it into, a way to get money back to the Beltway, to get money back to corporate donors and so forth. And as part of that process, they wanted to make the VA more efficient. And investing in the community seemed inefficient. I mean, why should the VA have to bear all the costs of there being a community that talks about mumps? That felt like a waste to these MBAs and these CEOs who were rotating in through the revolving door. So they cut all that out. They shut down the standards organization. They shut down the community organization. No more magazine, no more training classes. All that stuff went away. They stopped working with Indian Health Service, who uses mumps. They stopped working with all the other vendors. All of that stuff stopped so that they could streamline and focus on their core competencies. Anybody remember core competencies from the 90s? A lot of companies self-destructed by focusing on their core competencies. Digital Equipment Corporation put itself out of business by focusing on its core competencies. So that's what the VA hierarchy did starting in the mid-90s. And it culminated in a situation in which, who could have foreseen this? They couldn't find mumps programmers, right? Because they destroyed the community that created the mumps programmers. With all the relationships gone, the individuals also vanished. But to a left brain mechanistic thinker, that's impossible, because relationships aren't real. Only things are real. Individuals are real. So the cause and effect made no sense to them. They were like the owner of the goose with the golden eggs, where the goose is the relationship and the egg is the thing. And they thought, well, there's no point to the goose. Let's just get the eggs. So by the year 2000, they're arguing that we now have to abandon the software we spent decades making because we can't find any programmers who could program it. They say, it's not taught in universities, so therefore it's impossible to get programmers. If you can't just put an ad in the paper and have people miraculously come out of the woodwork with all the skills you need, well, it's not even worth doing then. Then it's just impossible. Literally 30 years before, people understood you have to create the community and the relationships in order to create the people. But the newer, more advanced, more profit-focused, systematic thinkers didn't understand about relationships. And so as a result, they self-destructed everything. This is a classic example. When you're really focused on the thing and not the relationship that produces the thing. You arrange things in such a way that you stop producing the thing, and then you say, well, I guess I should move on now. The soil is all expended. There's no more fertility. Let me go find some other agency I can pillage until there's nothing left of it either. Right? I think it's not well known to Americans that there is a class of roving CEOs in the United States. And their job is to go from company to company, making companies efficient, by which they mean squeezing a bunch of extra profit out of the organization. And then when the organization begins to fall apart, they jump ship to another corporation. And they get very good at jumping right before the signs are clear and with a big golden parachute, because look at how we've driven up the profits. And then behind them in their wake, they leave devastation. Right? All these companies fall apart because all the training programs are gone, all the legacy programs are gone, all of the elders who really knew the stuff, who used to mentor the new people, they've all been fired before they could vest in their retirements in order to save retirement money. I mean, all this stuff is done to make the organization efficient at the cost of making it fall apart. And this happens all over this country every day because people don't understand relationships as being the source of the things that we care about.
Yeah, one of the things that we actually explore in another meetup is the idea of form and function. Yes. So that, where people are focused on the forms rather than what the functions are. Then you're talking about the relationships that, that you're talking about that actually creates the thing, that actually serves its purpose, where you start worrying about the form, which is the group. That, oh, why are we using this group? Why do we need this here? And let's streamline this. I start to see a little bit how a more of a systematic way of thinking or cookie cutter approach could actually have a negative impact on how actually an organism would actually function. So thank you for that.
My pleasure.
Wasn't that isn't that the tragedy behind the 737 MAX? Yes. And in the age of Michael Millikan, where they had these corporate raiders and they wrote a whole book about it, I forgot it. It's the same underlying principle playing out in different ways.
It is. And it's an illustration of Nietzsche's principles of the relative strengths and weaknesses of the Dionysian and the Apollonian. Yes. The Apollonian believes if I could just get in charge of everything and measure everything and get it all as part of the plan, I could make it better. But he doesn't understand that it's not possible for any one person or any one committee to understand all the things they need to understand in order to be in charge of everything. It's really important that we're not in charge of most things. If most things more or less work, we should mostly leave them alone. And we should focus on the problem areas where we can reduce the scope of what we're trying to change to make it small enough that we have a chance to have a plan that could actually work. And then all the other things we left alone continue to work because we didn't break them, right? There's a baby and bathwater problem here. But to an Apollonian personality, that's unacceptable. The Apollonian needs to prove his ideology. He needs to get in control of everything. He needs to erase all of the detritus of the past, all of the inefficiencies of the past, and show how he can make every last thing better. And in doing so, he imposes his own blind spots upon the system that he's trying to change and kills all the things he doesn't understand. And then, well, then they split into two camps. There's the naive ideologues who then go down with the ship because they didn't see it coming. But then there is our professional class in the United States that know exactly what they're doing. And they know when it's time to hop ship to the next organization to ensure that they never take responsibility for what they just did.
Just a quick question. Was that Barbarians at the Gate? Do you remember that book, R.J.R. Nabisco?
Yes.
Yeah, Barbarians at the Gate is one. That was the R.J.R. Nabisco takeover.
Yes.
Which, that was a slightly different. Then there was also the Den of Thieves is the one that was actually more about Boesky and all of them, the corporate raiders of the 80s. Yeah. And that was written by James Stewart. It was an interesting time on Wall Street.
Yes.
A quick on the side, Amazon just bought Warner Brothers. I don't know if you guys heard, but so I was telling my son, I think Amazon is just going to control everything. They're going to buy up everything. You know, this entire world is going to become Amazon.
We've tried that model before.
Yes.
Yeah, but they're much more
Yeah,
strategic.
I get residual checks from Warner Brothers. I mean, you know, from some projects I've done, and now it's going to come from Amazon for a Warner Brothers project I've done in the past, and I find that a little disturbing. I don't know why.
Facebook, Microsoft, Apple, and Google won't let them.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
Thank you, David.
But I will say this: Amazon, and I don't mean to interject, but Amazon acquires more strategically than I think anybody that has in the past. Everything they do is very well planned out, where they have a vision. They kept no cash on hand for such a long time for a reason. They had a vision of the future. You know, these Googles, Apples, they have all this tons of cash on hand. They weren't getting any interest on it. Well, why are you keeping it? But Amazon actually had a vision of the future, where to go, whether it be cloud, whatever it may be. And they kept reinvesting, and they still do. They're a little bit more they're a little bit different than any other corporation that I've seen in recent memory.
Yeah. Stephen, and then Phil, and then we'll wrap up with the text.
I've been, I play foghorn, leghorn, and I like to stir the dog.
Yes.
In the past few years, one of my favourites is I get out the fishing rod and I put my Donald Trump doll on the end of the fishing rod and cast it into the pit of liberals or whatever, who keep on telling me that they're all peace and love and kumbaya, and suddenly the teeth come out and they're all tearing the Trump doll to pieces. And when you come up with things like Putin is a monster, he's a monster. The only reason that anything is bad is happening is that there is some malfactor in the universe making bad things happen. And I'm not the smartest guy around, but I just figure you got to come up with something better than that sort of reaction. That's my question.
Yeah.
People go around saying they're good. I'm a good person, therefore good things should happen to me and my enemies should all be smited. And it's my problem with that, and this is something that's been lost with the loss of Christianity. And your old-time Christian had something very right, that everybody can be tempted. And we've lost sight of that.
Mm-hmm.
These people that parade around expressing their virtue and saying how wonderful they are seem to be people that just don't realise what temptation is. They've been born to countries where there's a social welfare system. They haven't been born in countries where there isn't a social welfare system, which you have to really... You're facing the worst temptations of human nature just to survive. I'm being told that I am a good person all the time by these people that have had good parents, good upbringing, everything's been going their way. Yeah. In most aspects, all their life. They haven't faced temptation. Yeah, 99 out of 100 are going to be good people when they haven't faced temptation.
Right.
What's he talking about?
So, part of what this is about is avoiding scapegoating, right? There is a temptation to scapegoat that is just baked into modernity. We long for simple answers with clean divisions between good and bad, and we want the bad guys to be bad and the good guys to be good. And it's among the reasons why we're currently obsessed with superhero movies. Is we want a world that is simpler than the one we're actually living in, because the world we're living in is frustrating the crap out of us. You can find eras in Hollywood when there were tastes for more complex, morally complex stories. I'm particularly fond of Hayao Miyazaki's animated films, like his film Princess Mononoke, in which you come to understand and sympathize with everybody involved in this horrific conflict. And horrible things happen. And people do horrible things, but you get to know why they did it and how from their perspective it seemed like the only option, and how those same people who in one moment are off, killing, and you're like, this is horrible, in the next moment they're off, taking care of prostitutes who've been abused, or taking in lepers and giving them a home and something that they can feel proud of. And you're like, this is the same person who was committing murder in the previous scene. And Miyazaki is saying, yeah, nobody is a devil and nobody is a saint. What we're stuck with is actual human beings who have actual human reasons for the things that they do. And the thing about being a modern is that we have moments when we glimpse the profundity of that truth and accept it, but then we read the newspaper and it encourages us to forget about that. It's like, no, there's good countries and bad countries. There's good leaders and bad leaders. There's good political parties and bad political parties. There is this tug of war for our understanding of the world between the more nuanced, profound understanding that's required to really, deal with the world well, and the cartoon version that we're constantly being sold that makes us more useful as voters and consumers. I think that's what Stephen's alluding to more than anything, is, the cartoon versions of the Democratic and Republican Party aren't going to do any of us any justice when it comes to trying to understand why the fate of this country is going the way that it actually is. You're going to add something, Stephen?
Oh, no. Well, I was just going to say that, yeah, this is this issue with corruption. Everyone thinks that they're the saint.
It's
And
the
I
other
remember
guys that are
this,
corrupt.
yeah, when the Soviet Union fell and the spies suddenly thought they might have been out of business. One spy was, had his face blinked, and he was saying what the business was like, and they're saying, what does it take to corrupt somebody, to undermine, somebody in a country? And the spy said that not everyone's the same. With some people, it's a bag of money. Another guy, you could offer the bag of money, and he's just not going to take it. People think that money is always the biggest issue. And he says, no, with another guy, it was his sense of ego. He wanted the power. He was a Saddam Hussein down the bottom. We'll help you rise to the top. He didn't care about money. He just wanted the power. And, another guy is susceptible to the beautiful Russian agent. We can't corrupt him with money. We can't corrupt him with office of power. But we'll send an adorable 18-year-old, highly trained, attractive Russian agent his way, and he will sell out his country. So this is what he was trying to say, that everybody's got their weak point. And this is a judgment of Paris.
Right.
What corrupted him? Oh, I offer you wealth and power. No, Paris said no. Oh, I offer you, victory. Paris said no. Hey, I offer you the most beautiful woman in all the world. Oh, yeah, that's got me, man. I'll sell myself. Everyone can be corrupted. They all have a weak point. And this is my big issue with people who are constantly describing themselves as the good folk.
Yes.
As Goethe pointed out in Faust.
Yes.
There are the good folk, the people that never sent the devil, even though the devil has them by the collar.
Yes.
Run away from those people, Stephen.
Yes, we must run. That's right. Yeah, I'm as fallible as anybody else. But I'm lucky in that I was born to a family of alcoholics. And I don't mean like borderline alcoholics. I mean, crawl into the bottle and die alcoholics. My grandma Pat, more than once in her life, was collected by the Seattle police, literally in the gutters in downtown Seattle, outside of taverns, where she had drunk herself unconscious. And because she couldn't stop, it's in our genes. We just can't stop. So I was born an alcoholic. I've never been a practicing alcoholic, but it doesn't matter. My wife can drink and have no problem, but I know I can't touch the stuff. I even smell wine and my mouth waters. Why would it water? I've literally never drunk it because I'm born this way, right? I'm hardwired physically And what Stephen's getting at is, what I'm describing is the easy case to identify, because this is kind of biological, psychological. But when you get into issues of character and say, what are the neglected parts of yourself that have been in pain all your life and have been pining, that you've been ignoring? If you get specialists and professionals who study you, some of them will be able to figure out that you might think that you're the best of all possible people until they figure out that you're just really a lot lonelier than you think you are. And they
Correct.
dangle the right person in front of you, and all of a sudden these things are coming out of you that you didn't know about.
Rick, I have to ask you this then. So your grandmother was an alcoholic, and yet she had a healthy, your mother or father, which one?
She was my mother's mother.
Mother's mother. And yet your mother, your grandmother had your mother, and then your mother had you.
Yeah.
Who just has this brilliant brain. So like, even though they talk about alcohol being so destructive, in your family, you guys must have pretty amazing genes to have procreated each other, the generations of children, grandchildren that have done quite well.
Well, I'll share a little secret with you. The more messed up you are, the more charismatic and gifted you have to be to compensate for it, right? If you are a raging alcoholic, you better be charming, right? People who are incredibly charming can get away with things that people who aren't charming can't get away with. And likewise, if you're even worse than that, if you're batshit crazy, it helps if you're an artist and you can put beauty in the lives of the people around you. And so they're like, Jesus, every time that guy comes over, he leaves and my house is a disaster. But on the other hand, my house has been painted and I've been exposed to all this great music and we had all these great conversations. Now, on my mom's side of the family, they combined insanity and addiction and all kinds of other dysfunctions with creativity and intelligence, because it's the only way they could reproduce, right? They had to be.
But I'm just talking about physical. I mean, people who drink alcohol while they're pregnant, their fetus actually gets physically malformed or something, right? Isn't there some of that going on? I'm just studying you, and I'm thinking, wow, Rick, you came out all right. If your mother had issues or your grandmother had issues.
So Jenny, it just depends. It just depends at the time of your life cycle when your disease is at its zenith. And she probably had it after her reproductive years. So she had children. Yeah. It just depends at the time. What time frame within which she was drinking? If she was drinking from she was 14 or after she was 35, between 20 and 35, she can have healthy siblings. Depends on what.
Okay. Because I was thinking, like, even when I was pregnant, not that I ever drank alcohol at all, but I was even extra careful. And my ex-husband would say, Jenny, no beer, not even one beer.
Yes.
So,
these addictions and mental illnesses and so on, like everything else, they're also organisms. They have their own life cycles.
Yes.
And so, there are a lot of people whose full addictions don't flower until later. When they're young and they're cute and they're innocent and they're full of, vim and vigor, they don't need it as much. But as they get angrier and tired, or as things don't work out for them, they start to compensate. And that's how it was with my grandma Pat. But so the point is, we're all carrying some kind of burden. Any goodnesses, have to come with some badnesses along the way. Let's call on Phil and Donald, and then we'll wrap up for today.
What I wanted to do was to help answer Joseph's question, but I need to address in passing what Stephen said. That, one does not, first you have to admit who you are, that you are subjected to temptation. That's why, you are a flightless bird, so to speak.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, when people ask me a difficult question, I will always probably say, well, I think I would do this, but I actually don't know. Only the situation when it gets tough do you know who you really are. Because that is when you turn from a do-gooder to a virtuous person. A do-gooder just go out, you know, they're in a comfortable position, they're going to hand out this and that, and they're doing a lot of good, creating a lot of friendships. Everybody says, oh, this guy is a good guy. But when the going gets tough, are they going to do that? That is what virtue actually exists, because it's easy to do those other things before the going gets tough. Now, to answer Joseph, or at least try to help, you know, I try to pose this thing, Roderick that I just watched yesterday was interesting, is on Hegel and modern life.
Nice.
It was really more about Marx, actually, but it came out of Hegel, because Marx came out of Hegel. And he said something that was very interesting. He says, human beings live in a dimension that's much more diverse and complex and multifaceted than what the modern world allows. For instance, it's about care. You care about your significant others, you care about your family, you care about your creative forces, music, whatever. You care about nature because you go out, even if you don't care about its existence, you know, it's there, you know, it gives you joy and all that. You care about all sorts of things. And what modern existence is to reduce that to an exchange value. And they would say, you are a pay worker. Here you are this, and you get paid. Mm-hmm. And you know, it's, I guess, humanistic enough to give you the weekend off so you could pursue those cares as a hobby, not a serious care in philosophy, but you could enjoy it as a hobby. And that's what the restriction is. Mm-hmm. So he said, at least in modern life, everybody knows this because, for instance, you ask somebody about their work and they say, oh, they love their work. They love their work, okay? And he gives very concrete demonstrations. He said, if by some happenstance, he's given an extended time off, he said very few, if any, will show up and work because they love their work.
Right.
Exactly. This is a proof that they don't actually love the work as much as other things they care about, right?
Right.
So that's interesting, right? You are more than an exchange value. He said, however, he says in the modern society, as the way it's constructed now, exchange value is a necessary but not a sufficient condition for your human existence. He says the test is, all you have to do is, well, I really don't like my work. I'm just not going to work for the next 8 years. He says, what you will find is you will be finding yourself living under a bridge.
Yes.
Right? And so therefore, it is necessary, but not sufficient, because the condition has been such that you are required to work in order to not live under a bridge. And so you have to be concerned about, but nonetheless, it is not sufficient to fulfill the potential of what you could be, what you care about, and all these things. So that is important to understand that distinction. You need to be concerned about not living under the bridge.
Yes.
But you also need to understand that you are an instrument of this economy, and that you actually care about your being in much more relationships to these other things you care about.
Yes.
So it was a very, very wonderful talk, because he puts it in very concrete things. You can say, oh, I understand what you're saying now. And everybody understands this. That's why they don't want to live under the bridge.
That's right.
That's why they don't go up to work, even though they love their work. when they're given time off,
Yeah.
because they have other cares about the being other than the exchange value of the production.
Thank you, Phil. All right, Donald, you get the final word for today.
I'll make it short. This is a Kenneth Smith story. Once in Baton Rouge, when he was still teaching at LSU, I was talking with him, and he said it was very interesting in his sort of introductory classes. I'm not sure he taught philosophy 101 literally, but he taught lower division classes. And he said that we get these freshmen, sophomores in here, and they don't understand about vices or temptation. Vices to them are, why would anybody be tempted by a vice? They're painful, they hurt you, there's something, they're bad. They're literally, vices are no temptation to them just because they're naive. And it comes as a great shock when they find out that sex is pleasurable. Drinking can be good, make you feel better. Not getting up in the morning, cutting class. These things are fine. They're wonderful.
Who knew?
Who would know that temptations actually have a power to tempt?
Yes.
These have only been abstract words. There's, like, for Stephen, we all should have been good all along. Why would we be tempted by something that did us harm?
That's what's great about this. Yeah, this is. I'm with you on that. We're backing you up, Stephen. There's like too many people don't know who they really are because they've never actually been tempted, and they think that's because they're especially virtuous, and they don't understand it's because they don't know themselves very well yet. There's something out there for everybody. It's why the
so you need to run away, Stephen. Run away from them.
Run from those people.
I'm trying to figure out, is it a bag of money? Is it power? Or is it going to be the beautiful woman?
In my years working in the defense industry, I kept waiting for that one secret that would be worth the young Russian honeypot. But I never got one valuable enough that was worth prying it out of me.
You weren't worth tempting.
You work in defense industry, so does Joseph, right? Joe Bullock? Joe? Huh, okay.
I did. I don't work anymore at all, but, well, I work every Monday afternoon.
Well, apparently you did. Apparently you did love
you
your
work
work
with Rick,
because
right,
you would be there working for free.
You didn't rise high enough so the Kremlin would send you the young, attractive babe.
Well, you have to understand that with the personnel theft of records from the Office of Personnel Management a decade or so ago, the clearances and projects of every cleared person in the United States are known to all our enemy intelligence agencies.
Yeah.
And so they would know if they wanted to target me, and I just guess they didn't. I kept hoping for a true test, Stephen, one I could fail and enjoy.
Don's like, come on, show me what you got. I'm willing to
show me that young girl.
Can I just say one thing, guys?
Sure.
I wanted, and I'm going to be quick too. I just wanted to piggyback on what Stephen said, because I am a firm believer in the concept of balance, right? So sometimes relationships are transactional and sometimes they're transformational, and it's situational and context, right? And people who say they're good, particularly those Christians, Stephen, get going, right? Because they are the ones that will take your eyes out if you let them, right?
Sharon, Sharon,
Yeah.
you are talking about the dimension of existence. That's what you're talking about.
Yes, it happens on the personal level too. When I
Yes.
show up at work, I'm not about to be transformational. I'm about to be transactional. Are you going to cover me this evening so I can cover you tomorrow? You know, and if you won't, then I probably will not cover you today.
Right.
I mean, that's just how it is. So it's a way of existence, and it's all about finding the happy medium. You know, that's the way I see it.
Yeah. To be human in the modern epoch is to be an amphibian.
Yes.
You can't help but inhabit the actual world of your actual needs, but you're not allowed to survive that way. So we also have to inhabit an artificial world of artificial needs and shift and pretend that we're getting what we want. And we go back and forth between the two worlds every day, over and over. All right. Well, next
Good
week.
discussion. Good. What are we doing next week?
Next week we'll carry on from here. We'll
Next week we'll attack one more sentence.
W.H. Auden. We are lived by powers we pretend to understand. We are lived by powers we pretend to understand. It's a line from a eulogy, a poem that he wrote for a friend of his who committed suicide. And he was shocked that his friend killed himself. And he tried to, W.H. Auden's one of the great poets, and he knew it. And he thought, I'm going to use my powers to try to do justice to this man and capture what was so good about him, but also how could a man that good do this thing? And this line is one of Kenneth's favorites out of it. So we'll talk about that, and we'll carry on to the paragraphs that follow.
Thank you. Thank you as
Well,
always.
thank you.
Thank you as
Thank you
always,
for
Rick.
answering my questions,
Thank
Rick,
you,
on
David.
war and human nature. I like that. Thank you very much.
My sincere pleasure.
All right, and I'm glad to learn you two girls are younger than me.
You plan
What
to
two
it?
girls are you talking about? What two
You,
girls?
Ginny, you and Sharon.
You and Sharon.
Well, first of all, I like the fact that you think that I'm a girl with all my gray hair. I like that.
Well,
Right?
I've got a few gray ones myself.
Right? And in another month, just another month, I'll tell you, I'm going to turn 70 on the 5th of May. So there you go. You can decide if I'm younger than you. You don't have
Oh, no,
to
you
tell me.
are. You are. Because in May, I'll turn 72.
Oh, you were born in May too?
Yes, the
What date?
21st.
Oh, you're not a Taurus. Are you just near the
No, I'm on the cusp, but it's
Yes.
Gemini. I looked up my birth year. Somebody asked me that question decades ago. Being on the cusp, are you Taurus or Gemini?
Actually, Sharon, I think I'm a couple of days older than you because I'm Taurus too. My birthday is April 22nd. So Earth Day. Yeah. So
Yeah.
anyway, there you go.
I'm Taurus to the core, so watch out.
Thanks,
Bye.
everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you,
All right,
David
guys.
and Rick.
Bye-bye.
Who's